Yeah, but is it amazing? Yes. It is an incredible ability. That's one of the first things when I was teaching undergraduates, I would always try to do is start by blowing their minds and showing them that they could do things that they didn't imagine they could do, and that nobody ever taught them because they never even knew, and their mother never even knew that they could do them linguistically, right? It's very deep. It's very deep, and it tells us a lot about this thing here. It tells us a lot about this incredible gift of human language. Yeah.
All right, so welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Craige Roberts. She is Professor Emerita at the Department of Linguistics of Ohio State University. Her work is focused on philosophy of language, primarily on formal semantics and pragmatics. She has a book called Modal Subordination, Anaphora and Distributivity, as well as a myriad of published articles on these and related topics. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Roberts.
Thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. Yeah, so I did want to start with a kind of general question about the field of formal semantics and pragmatics. I mean, how would you describe the field? Maybe mention like the Montague grammar tradition in particular. Like, what are some of the main targets? I mean, advances people make and so on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, if you really want to hear about it, you'll listen to your interview with Barbara Partee, who was my advisor at UMass Amherst back in the 1980s and was one of the people most responsible for bringing Montague grammar to prominence, because in her background as a linguist, she recognized that his work to bring formal tools to bear on an analysis of natural language and how the meanings of the parts of a sentence or an utterance contribute to the meaning of the whole, that could be combined with Chomskyan syntactic analysis of utterances to offer a really exciting foundation for the study of meaning in natural language. And I'm using natural language as opposed to like logics or artificial languages in computing. So that's why we talk about natural language. But it could be any language, English, any of all the hundreds, thousands, I don't know how many there are. So really, we use these logical tools as one of my professors a long time ago taught me, Roger Higgins. The virtue of formalizing these things is that it makes very precise predictions. There's no ambiguity, there's no lack of clarity about the meanings that we predict. So for each word in a language, you can offer a translation of what you might take to be the basic literal meaning. That's a crude way of describing it, but it's just the simplest way to start. And each word in syntax is made to combine with other words in particular ways. If you have a verb, if it's intransitive, it needs a subject, which is usually some kind of noun phrase. If it's a transitive verb, it needs a subject and an object, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, some verbs take sentential complements. John believes that it is raining. That it is raining itself as a sentence. And believe needs something like that in order to form a complete sentence. And then believe and any verb will tell you something about what it means to take that object or that sentential complement and that subject and put them together, what kind of meaning results as a function partly of the meanings of the parts. So John likes Mary is very different in meaning than Mary likes John, just because even though they have the same three words, they combine in different ways. And those combinations are syntactically constrained. This is what the Chomskyan syntax studies. But then the Montague grammar tells you, well, you can take the meaning of the whole to be a function of the meaning of like plus the contributions of its arguments, the noun phrases. And it proceeds in a very systematic way. If you know anything about the lambda calculus, it's very handy as a tool for the kind of thing we're doing, because it lets you abstract away. You know that any sentence that means X likes Y is going to mean that the liker is X and the likey is Y. And you can abstract away from likes and say that, and then take the different arguments in the order the syntax tells you to tell you what the resulting meaning of the whole is. So that lambda calculus gives you a way of abstracting on the end meaning to get at the the contribution of the functor, the verb. And because syntax itself in any language is a very complex phenomenon, we can utter very complex sentences. They can be recursive. The old joke, this is the house that Jack built. This is the cat that lives in the house that Jack built. This is the rat that was chased by the cat that lives in the house that Jack built, et cetera, et cetera. And there's no end. So those are recursive relative clauses that we can build using the syntax. And there's many different kinds of recursive structures in syntax. And accordingly, it's very easy using these abstraction principles to give recursive meanings, given that we know the meanings of each of those relative clauses that we add on every time we get the sentence to be longer. So this together gives us a beautiful way of matching what we know about syntactic structure and its constraints and limitations and what makes a well-formed grammatical sentence of a language with the semantic calculus that lets us put the meanings together, given that we know the meanings. We're now native speakers. Yeah. So that's something about, and the formal part is that in translating each of the parts, the meanings of the parts and the syntactic combinatorics, for each of those, you have a translation or a function argument application rule. You take the functor, the verb, and take its arguments. Since you have formal counterparts of each of those things that are translatable in a logical language, an intentional logic, then you have a very precise prediction of what the meanings could be. And if the parts are ambiguous, then the resulting thing is ambiguous. If John saw the man with the binoculars is ambiguous, because it is. He might have used the binoculars to see the guy, or it might be the guy with the binoculars. Then you're going to have two different syntactic structures. That's already well known, and there are tests for that in syntax that are independent of what we know about the different meanings. Then the function argument structure associated with those two different syntactic structures should yield us the two different known semantic the interpretations, the possible meanings. And so you can test going back and forth between the independently motivated syntax, the meanings of the parts, what you get when you put them together using the semantic calculus, and our intuitions as native speakers are the real data here, yeah? And you put all that together and you have a testable system for making predictions about how the meanings of the parts combine to make more complex meanings. So that's formal semantics, and it is accordingly scientific because each of these translations is a hypothesis about the meaning of the part or the syntactic structure in which it's participating. And then you're testing against your intuitions, not just your own. We can do crowdsourcing to test the intuitions of large groups of native speakers and psycholinguistic experimentation. So, we're not just, going on our own intuitions, but we can use that data to test our scientific theory. And sometimes it works really well. And sometimes it works really well for a long time. And then you find a data point or a set of data points typically where you're going, that's kind of skewed, or it doesn't quite get at what's going on. And then, like in the scientific method generally, back to the drawing board. You have to look for some more data, revise your hypotheses, test again, blah, 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 on and on. So that makes what we do in formal semantics scientific. A beautiful system, a real breakthrough in linguistics. People like Chomsky himself have been very skeptical of the possibility of saying something useful and interesting and scientifically interesting in the sense of provable, disprovable, right? Chomsky had himself been very skeptical, at least up into the 90s, about the possibility of doing that. And Partee, who was his student, was one of the people who I think laid the groundwork to show that skepticism is not entirely warranted. Now, so that's kind of what formal semantics is. As I said, there's way so much more to it than I just laid out. But what you really were asking is what's the difference between semantics and pragmatics? And formal pragmatics is interesting because there are a lot of respects in which you can't just, if you want to get them at what somebody means, what they, in the sense of the philosopher Grice, The meaning of an utterance is what the speaker intended for you to understand, that they intend to convey to you, and that may be the literal meaning, or it might be something else. It could even be, if I look at you skeptically after you do some screwed up thing and say nice, then I'm actually trying to intend to convey an entirely opposite meaning, it seems, from what nice usually means as a compliment. It's no compliment. Yeah, it's a criticism. So Grice's foundational work back starting in the 60s on the study of pragmatics is like thinking about how contextual factors can come to bear to either enrich the meaning of an utterance in a way that you can't just entirely account for on the basis of the literal content, or disambiguate, or even flip the meaning, as in the sense of that sarcastic nice. So we've always known that there are things like this, but here's a huge class of cases where context is crucial to get the meaning, and these are things that are anaphoric. So it's one thing if I say Troy is wearing navy, and it's another thing if I say he's wearing navy. He who? Well, obviously we say things like he's wearing navy all the time. So how do we understand each other? Because he doesn't have a meaning all by itself. It does in the technical sense, that it's a function from something salient in context to the referent or the bound variable sense of that constituent. He is a pronoun. Yeah, but it's always in context. You have to look at context. A class of anaphoric elements are the indexicals. When I say I, because you're a native speaker of English, that means that the speaker is referring to themselves. If you know who's speaking, if you know that's Craige Roberts, then when I say, I'm wearing glasses, then it means Craige Roberts is wearing glasses. At least, it's actually richer than that. It also tells you that Craige Roberts concedes that she herself is wearing glasses. So there's a de se component to using I. But, and there's a whole lot of indexicals, the work that, of course, is most famous from David Kaplan's work in philosophy of language, including here and now. I am here now. When spoken by a native speaker of English, that's always true. It can't be false, okay? Because of the meanings, not because Craige Roberts couldn't be sitting here in her apartment in New York City on August 23rd, 2024. That's a possible, I could have been somewhere else. But I am here now is always true because as spoken by the speaker in a place at a time, the way that I here and now work, they refer to the locus. And in a sense, the way I think of it, which is not Kaplan, the origin of a sort of space-time continuum in which one finds oneself as speaker. Yeah. So, but to know what the speaker means in say uttering one of those things, you have to know something about the context. Yeah. And there are many, many, many other things like that. Here's a very interesting case. If I say, John only introduced Sue to Bill, that means something slightly different than John only introduced Sue to Bill. One of those could be true, but the other one false. But it's exactly the same words and exactly the same syntactic structure. And the only difference is the prosodic emphasis, the focus that I use. So John only introduced Sue to Bill versus John only introduced Sue to Bill. Okay. So now that suggests that there's something about that prosodic focus that's making appeal to the context of utterance. And maybe I'm talking about the group of people that John introduced to Bill. And if I say John only introduced Sue to Bill, that makes sense. But it would be very strange in that context to say, remember, we're talking about who John introduced to Bill. It would be very strange there to say John only introduced Sue to Bill. That's off in some way. And that tells you that whatever the proper analysis, that the prosodic emphasis, which makes a difference in the truth conditional meaning, when it could be true, when it could be false, and hence we think means it means something different. I'm conveying a different message. That difference is sensitive to context in a certain very important way. So that's another thing that maybe is anaphoric in some sense, but to what? Well, we say to a set of alternatives following work by Mott's Root, the alternatives that are relevant in the context of utterance. So there are many, many things like this, and we could go on for another hour just listing and illustrating some of these differences in meaning that are conveyed as a function of context. And a lot of times the words themselves are sensitive to context in a way so that you can't really properly convey the meaning intended without knowing some specific thing about the context. So how do we, if you want a real theory of meaning, not just a theory of literal meaning, okay, again, we've got the syntactic structure and we've got the semantic calculus, and we map one to the other. There's a logical relation between them, and that tells you, as it were, the literal meaning, or if it's ambiguous, the possible literal meanings. But the disambiguation or the enrichment or the resolution of an aphora, like with he, or understanding these prosodic differences, this requires that you know something about the context of utterance. So if you really want a theory of meaning, it does not suffice to have a theory of semantic content, of literal content. You have to know something about the context. And then the question is that just a free-for-all? If you look at some work in non-formal pragmatics, I would call it like it's very prominent, a relevance theory of Spurvey and Wilson since the 1980s. They just say, well, something's relevant to the extent that an utterance is relevant to the extent that the interlocutors can draw more useful inferences from the information, the literal content or something. That's pretty Wild West, if you ask me. Okay, I think that that's too unconstrained, and I think that, and this is the way my work has developed, but I'm not the only one. People since Gerald Gazdar and a variety of other people, and certainly starting with Hans Kamp and Irene Heim, have argued that there are very specific ways in which the literal content appeals to context, and there's certain ways in which context makes available some ways of resolving an aphora or relevantly disambiguating, but does not make other ways available. So it's not just some free-form inferencing process going on. I think even more, I think that if you understand context properly, it's going to actually promote certain interpretations of what is subsequently said in a way that makes others irrelevant. And you don't even notice the irrelevant ambiguities. Okay. So if you really want a theory, a good scientific theory, not just of literal meaning, but of literal content, shall we call it, what you get from the formal semantics, but of speaker's meaning, what a speaker that could predict. If you have the context of a certain character and the speaker says this utterance, what would you predict that they would mean in that context? Okay? So you want a theory like that. That's a really interesting theory of meaning, and not just of semantic content in that literal, narrow sense. Yeah? And that means you need more than just syntactic structure and the semantic rules. You need a theory of what is a context and how does it interact with semantic content. And again, if you wanted the advantage of the formal semantics is it makes very clear predictions, very clear, unambiguous, precise predictions. So I want my formal semantics to give me as much clarity about what we would expect a meaning to be in a given context, to make predictions. If I have this context and so says this, I predict that this is what they would mean in this context. This is how they would expect you to resolve he or now. This is how they would expect you to understand the prosodic focus and a wide variety of other things. Okay? So does that give you some sense of the difference between semantics and pragmatics and the virtue of the formalism?
Yeah, no, that's really great. So especially on the sort of value of the formalism. Yeah, it's nice to think. Well, what you're doing is building better and better models to account for the data, and make better
Yeah,
predictions that you can test and revise, and
right.
um, it's scientific in that way, which is good. I mean, I feel sometimes worry that a fair amount of philosophy is not as much like that as it could be, or perhaps should be. But yeah, it feels it's good. So yeah, one thing you talk about is this distinction between the pragmatic and more formal semantics. Maybe if you talk a bit more about that, because I mean, I've there's this worry that they might be potentially sort of in tension as different sort of approaches to modeling language. So I remember getting introduced to some issues in the philosophy of language years ago from a lecture series by John Searle. He's a big pragmatist guy and was very critical of the more quote unquote formal approaches, that they perhaps over idealize language and miss out on critical pragmatic aspects and such.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, so what do you think about the potential tension between pragmatic and formal semantic approaches, and maybe more about this Searle style worry?
Yeah. Yeah, I know John Searle. I heard him give lectures a long time ago when I was first going into graduate school in linguistics. That must have been 1979. He gave a summer series at Indiana University, where I was then finishing an undergrad. And I've read his work carefully since, and I've worked on speech acts myself. So that's what he's famous for, is work on speech acts. And um, one thing about John Searle's speech acts, which comes out of the work of J.L. Austin, who was his professor, his advisor at Oxford, I think, is that so they have this taxonomy of kinds of speech acts. Now, let's see if I can think of some of the kinds of things in this Searlean taxonomy. You have questions, and you have something like assertions, but that's not what they call it. I have a poor memory these days. But they also have things like promises and
Assertives,
can you
right,
remember
was one of them.
assertives, but also promises and also
Assertives, the commissives. I think commissives would be under promises would be under commissives.
yeah,
Yeah, and then directives, expressives, and declarations were the five.
yeah.
Yeah.
And he might have something like pleas or requests or something like that. So it's not just directives; it's other kinds of things that you might say with an imperative sentence or something. Yeah. Now, Searle, and it's very intelligent work. By the way, I'm not demeaning the work of John Searle, so I hope that will become clear. But I disagree very much with him about the nature of these things. So that's what we're talking about. What's my take on it? The the That's kind of a hodgepodge. Like, if you look at John Searle's the set of, it's a long set of types of speech acts. That's why I can't remember it. It's not rationalized in my mind. It's like you would expect there to be this other speech act over here in this corner. It's not like there's a rational space that's filled in with kinds of speech acts. So it's kind of hard to remember it if you have a bad memory like me. And they're kind of a hodgepodge. So some of them, like assertives and promises, they're both use indicative sentences. Let's stick with English here because that's my only real, strong language. They both use indicative sentences. A speaker would use an indicative sentence to utter the two of them. So you might say, uh, um, an assertive is it's raining, but or I think just I'm going to the grocery store. Okay, let's say that's an assertive. But a promissive might be, I promise to go to the grocery store. Okay. Now, those are both indicative sentences of English. That's present tense, first person, uh, subject of each of them. I'm going to the grocery store. I promise to go to the grocery store. It's a different verb. I am going, but the present progressive of go, but and promise, I promise. But otherwise, they're both just indicative first person present tense sentences. What tells you, if you look at a sentence, or I think a promissive for him might also be, I swear to go to the grocery store, right? Well, that is very different in syntactic structure than I promise to go to the grocery store, but still, I think you might call it a promissive. Why? Well, you're under some commitment. You've made a certain kind of commitment, and maybe there are sort of social consequences if you don't come through. Whereas if you just say, I'm going to the grocery store, you're just making a claim about what you were in the process of doing right now. That's all. But there doesn't seem to be a commitment to doing it, at least not on the surface of the sentence. What's the difference? Well, in those particular cases, promise and swear themselves have certain content that conveys a commitment on the part of the subject, whoever that might be. And in this case, it happens to be the speaker, and the action associated with the infinitival complement. Yeah. But it only becomes a permissive, as far as I understand, for Searle, if it's the first person subject. So John promises to go to the grocery store it's not a permissive, because in uttering that indicative sentence, I'm not making a promise because I'm not John, right? So it's the same verb, but it's not first person. So it's just another indicative. It's just a claim, an assertive about something that John is promised to do, right? Or swears or whatever. So you can't just say that it's the nature of the verb that makes it a promissive. It's somehow about the combination of the verb and the subject and blah, 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 right? What about directive? So what I'm trying to get at here, and we'll say something more about it, is in what sense can you associate these different types of speech acts, according to Searle and earlier Austin, with particular features of the actual linguistic utterances used to make those speech acts in such a way as to predict, given the syntactic structure and the words, whether it is a promissive or an assertive? What are we looking for here? Okay. And do we, if we find out that, for example, it seems like in this case, it's just a function of the meaning of promise or swear on one hand, and plus the fact that the subject is first person, do we need to say anything about speech act types to explain why it has this commitment associated with it? Okay. Is the speech act taxonomy linguistically motivated? Yeah. In terms of its formal structure. Look at directives. Okay. So, a directive might be go to the grocery store. Yeah. If I say that to you, don't you feel that you are under some kind of commitment? Yes. Okay. But I could also do it by saying something like, I hereby direct you to go to the grocery store. Yes. Do you agree that that's also a directive? Do you? I mean,
I guess. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not trying to tell you what your intuitions are, but haven't I issued a directive if I say I hereby direct you to go to the grocery store? Especially and here's another factor we haven't controlled for it. If I have control and power over you, if I'm your little sister and you're my much older brother and you're an authority and I'm not, then saying I hereby direct you to go to the grocery store is just a joke because I don't have the power. So there's a contextual factor as well, to not just I hereby direct you to da and first person and the meaning of direct, but also the power relation between the interlocutors. And Searle's interested in all this. It's not like I'm saying something he doesn't know. What I'm asking you is, what in the utterances themselves, go to the grocery store versus from a person in authority to a person, I'm the big sister, you're the little brother, and I'm the one in authority, and I hereby direct you to go to the grocery store, right? So now we have two different, one is an imperative, go to the grocery store, and the other one is an indicative, because it's I hereby. The only thing that's like immediate about it is the hereby, I direct you to go to the grocery store is almost a description of a speech act, but I hereby direct you to go to the grocery store. That's a directive. okay, because of hereby somehow, or in combination with said. So on the one hand, you can have two different utterances with the same grammatical mood, indicative, but one's one speech act type and one's another. One's assertive, one's promissive. Okay. On the other hand, you can have two different English utterances with different grammatical mood, imperative versus indicative, and they're both directives in some sense. Why? And what about that contextual factor? Why should that matter? So the speech act, what I'm sketching here with just a couple of cases, but there's a large literature, a long literature starting from way back when Searle's work was addressed by other philosophers of language like Green and so forth, arguing that there's no clear way to map natural language utterances onto a taxonomy of speech acts in such a way that there's a clear regular relationship between the two classifications. So I started off by saying, well, speech acts seem to have the taxonomy of speech acts doesn't exist in a logical space in the sense that you would expect that. Well, there's a hole over here, you expect the speech act here, or these two shouldn't overlap in that logical space or something. So we can't find that rationale to it. And on the other hand, there's no clear way to map between utterances and speech acts, or speech acts and utterances in such a way as to find clear guidelines in language about exactly what speech acts someone is going to make in uttering that sentence. Okay, and one in the same utterance, a directive, say, could sometimes be, in one of the papers I wrote, I talk about call a taxi. It could be a directive to you to call a taxi. I need a taxi, I'll call a taxi. I could be your friend and you could be drunk at the bar and I'm begging you to call a taxi instead of driving your car home. That's not a directive. That's a plea of a certain sort, right? Etc. So in different contexts, one in the same utterance might seem to have a different flavor as a function of what my intentions are with respect to you and what the situation calls for, what's needed, what we're planning. Okay? So it's not clear that there's an easy map between Searlean speech acts and natural language. I don't mean that there's nothing to say and that he's not saying anything interesting about the social functions of language and the different ways in which we use language, but it's not clear that these things are regular parts of the natural language system per se, as opposed to observations about the way we use utterances, given what their content is and what they can mean in particular different contexts. So what do you want to say about speech acts? Well, in my own work, and I'm not the only one, Paul Portner and a variety of others who argued this going a long way back in the literature and in linguistics, that really across languages, there are at least 3 universal grammatical moods. We don't know a single language that doesn't have indicative, interrogative, and imperative moods. And in all of those languages, at the very least, indicatives are used to make assertions. They may be used in other ways, but they're always used to make assertions. Interrogatives are always used to pose questions. Again, they may be used in other ways. Wittgenstein says just because you have, a screwdriver doesn't mean you can't use it like a hammer, And imperative, whatever else other use you may put it to, will be used in a lot to make, to issue directives, to pose suggestions about what to do to other people with more or less authority behind it. Yeah. So we know this about natural language. It has these 3 grammatical moods. There are other grammatical moods in certain languages. And of course, my brain went dead, so I can't think of them. But I don't know of another mood that's universal across languages. So But what can we say about that in Speech Acts, right? Because certainly if you want to talk about a speech act, you should be able to talk about, and he does, assertions, questions, and directions. Everybody issues all three of those things if they're native speakers of a language, and they know that a sort of canonical way to do that is to use an indicative, an interrogative, or an imperative. Okay. So what if these are the basic, if you want to call them speech acts, right? They're the basic illocutionary forces that we use in natural language. And there are different flavors of these, or you can use an assertion to suggest something you want somebody to do. And if you want to call that a direction in Searlean terms, I don't mind. It's just not the canonical use of an assertion, okay? So why? Well, why would we expect that indicative is used to make assertions? Well, what are assertions? You look at the classic work of Robert Stalnaker, and an assertion is it's the use of a proposition it's proffering a proposition to your interlocutors with the intention that they accept it as true and add it to our common ground, our common fund of at least assumed true stuff, okay. We may be lying to each other about what we assume to be true, but this is the fiction we're maintaining. Yeah. So when we do that, then what is the content of the indicative utterance? It's a proposition, and in fact, that's what it is in Montague grammar. Proposition in Montague grammar, we talk about it as a set of possible worlds. These are the possible ways things might be in which it could be true. If I say, I went to the grocery store this afternoon, there are a whole lot of possible worlds. You didn't know before I said that whether this afternoon I stayed home, or I went to the park, or I went to the grocery store, or any of a number of myriad other things I could have done here, correct? But if I say I went to the grocery store this afternoon, then I'm proposing that you knock out of possibility, not out of the candidates for possibility, for the way things are. I want you to add the proposition that to our common ground that I went to the grocery store, and thereby knock out all the worlds, the possible worlds, the ways things might be that in which that's not true. Yeah, that's what Stalnaker calls the context set. Each proposition is a set of possible worlds. You just do set theory. When you have two propositions, they overlap in some possible worlds, unless there are contradictions, and then you've got nothing, right? But as long as if I went to the grocery store this afternoon, it's consistent with all the information I had before. You just intersect that set of possible worlds with the ones that in which all the other propositions we accept as true are true. And then we've got a new context. We've got a new common ground, or set of a fund of propositions we assume to be true. And correspondingly, we have a now smaller context set, the set of possible worlds consistent with what we assume to be true. These are our candidates for reality. Yeah. So that's what we do with an assertion. And by golly, the Montague grammar formal semantic account of an indicative sentence is that it gives you a set of possible worlds, right? So it is natural. That's why it's canonical that the thing we do with an indicative sentence is propose an addition to the common ground, which would accordingly restrict the context set, the set of candidates for reality. It's just pragmatic sense that that's what we use it for. Now, again, it's a screwdriver, doesn't mean it's a wrench, doesn't mean you can't use it for a hammer, but that's what we canonically do with it, right? That makes sense to you, Troy? Yeah? So.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So then what about interrogative? Well, interrogatives are really interesting. Took a lot longer for us to come to a formal semantic account of interrogatives. But I would say more or less the standard account now, going back to work by Karttunen and by Grunendark and Peters in formal semantics, is that the formal semantic content of an interrogative clause is not a single proposition, a single set of possible worlds, but a set of propositions, a set of sets of possible worlds. So why that type? Well, what a question really does is, given our common ground, it sets up a set of different possible ways things might be. Okay? So if I say, who did John introduce to Bill? First of all, I'm sort of presupposing that John and Bill and some other people were at, say, a party that we're talking about, etc. So we know in the context what kind of situation was under consideration, and we know that we expect that John was there and Bill was there, right? So there's a certain common ground and a certain set of assumptions that we have. And among other things, that, John did introduce Bill to some people, maybe nobody, but maybe that's possible. Let me put it this way. It's possible that he introduced Bill to some people on the occasion in question. So then if we have some idea of who the people at the party were, or the other occasion in question, then we have an idea of what the set of possible answers are. If there were 10 other people at the party, there are 10 to the 2 possible combinations of those people that he did or did not introduce to Bill. In other words, we know the class of possible answers to that question given other contextual assumptions, right? So in a sense, you can best characterize a question as a set of possible answers, a set of possible ways that you might, as an addressee who addresses that question, you might propose that we restrict the context set, yeah? We might enrich the common ground. So we characterize the question as a set of propositions, the set of possible answers to that question. And it turns out that you can perfectly predict that formally once you understand what a WH question or a yes-no question is semantically, how that contributes to the meaning of the whole interrogative utterance. Okay, so and then once you know what that is, well, now Stonenecker didn't say anything about what a question was. And this is where I borrowed other earlier work on questions and said, maybe we could think about questions in context and how they constrain interpretation. And so maybe we can build this into, or enrich the Stoneneckerian model and say that when we have a context, we not only have a common ground, and hence a context set, but we have a set of questions under discussion. And those questions constrain what's relevant in context in a certain way. If I ask you, who did John introduce to Bill? And you say, it's raining. It's like, huh? Yeah, that was a non sequitur. Why is it a non sequitur? Well, unless you explicitly say, I don't want to address that question, or let's talk about something else. When I pose a question, if you're a cooperative interlocutor, you are under some obligation to address that question, even if you say, I don't know who we introduced them to, right? You're supposed to, if you're cooperative, you're supposed to give me the information that will at least result in a partial answer to the question. Yeah. So that's my account of questions was, well, in a discourse, we not only have a set of questions under discussion, and I said, well, you could think about the most basic question is Stalnecker's. He says, we don't really know the way the world is. So I could say, when we're in discourse, the basic question is, what is the way things are, right? So we're in this particular discourse, and we've been talking about the party, and you say, who did John introduce to Bill? Then there's a set of possible questions that, and if you think about it formally, you have the context set, the set of possible ways things are consistent with the common ground. And a question, the set of possible answers, actually forms a structure over the context set. It tells you that there's a cell here, a cell here, a cell here, they don't overlap. And each of them is a possible answer to that question. Yeah? So That is a structure that's when I ask a question, I've imposed that on the context set and ask you, if you can, to help me resolve that question by at least saying, well, I know it wasn't Stephen. So he didn't introduce it to Stephen. So I can knock out all the cells that are possible answers in which he was one of the people that he introduced to John was Stephen. Yeah, that's a partial answer. It doesn't tell me whether he introduced him to Sue or Janice or Ignacio, but it's a partial answer, and that would be cooperative of you. So that's my contribution to understanding about the nature of a context, is that we also know what questions under discussion. Another way of thinking about it is just the topic of conversation. Is the question under discussion. And a question in this sense really is, it's not an interrogative sentence. Sometimes we know what the question under discussion is without actually uttering a question. If I'm looking at an accident and you walk in and I go, then if you have information, you're supposed to give it to me, right? So that enriches our notion of context, and accordingly, it helps us understand what's an appropriate utterance in that context and how we should understand the utterance. You don't even have to say, if I say, who did John introduce to Bill? You don't even have to say John introduced Sue to Bill. You could just say Sue. And I would understand that was intended as at least a partial answer to the question under discussion, right? And also it tells you that it's not appropriate for you, if I said the question is, who did John introduce to Bill? It's not appropriate to answer the question, John introduced Bill to Sue. I'm sorry, John introduced Sue to Bill. That would be an inappropriate response because I focused Bill, but that was part of the question. And we focused the answer, okay? Remember one of the puzzles we started with was, what is this prosody thing? And one way of thinking about it is it tells you the set of alternatives under consideration. And those alternatives are different possible answers to the question under discussion. Okay? So it sheds light on that at the same time. And then what about imperatives? Well, now, again, there's a lot of really exciting work on imperatives over the last 15, 20 years. And I think I have a current paper coming out, which is in the tradition of, Paul Portner, among others, in which I argue that one of the things that we also understand about discourse is the intentions and goals and plans of the interlocutors as they bear on the conversation. And that when I issue a directive, I'm suggesting that you adopt a goal to realize that. If I say go to the grocery store, I'm proposing that you adopt the goal of going to the grocery store. And then that puts you under certain commitments, and it makes a yes or a no answer appropriate in a way that it's not, is just as an answer to a question. Yeah, the answer to, did John go to the grocery store? Yes, no. That suggests that we add the proposition that John went to the grocery store to the common ground. But if I say go to the grocery store and you say yes, that doesn't add a proposition to the common ground. It adds to our common information. There's a set of plans and intentions that we understand you to be committed to. And now I will add that Troy, the addressee, is committed to going to the grocery store. Okay? These things interact in important and interesting ways. Paul Portner's written some wonderful things about how that bears on the relationship between John, you accepting go to the grocery store, and the indicative utterance, Troy should go to the grocery store, etc. So there are implications for what's true and false in the common ground from the goals and intentions we adopt. But you don't reduce the interrogative or the imperative mood to the indicative mood. So now, going back to speech acts, because I wanted to make sure I addressed your question. What do I have to say about Searlean speech acts? Well, we know that in natural language, there are these 3 grammatical moods in every language. We know that going back to classical Stalnackerian accounts of the force of an indicative, it's not built into it. I can say, Troy's going to the grocery store as an assertion, or is it an answer to a question. You can say to me, what did Marjorie tell you? And I can say, Troy's going to the grocery store. Now, I have not, in answer to that question, asserted that Troy's going to the grocery store, because it's understood that I mean that to be relevant as an answer to what Marjorie told me. Yeah. And hence, it's like a partial answer, just like Sue was the answer to who did John introduce to Bill. What I mean is Marjorie told me that Troy is going to the grocery store. And that's what would be asserted, taking that to be the answer to that question. So you don't just take an indicative utterance. Always, it depends on the context. If it by itself is an assertion on the part of the speaker, right? Depends on its relationship to the question and a variety of plans and intentions, a variety of other things. So the correlation between indicative mood and assertion is just the canonical usage as a function of context and a variety of other, and also if I said it sarcastically, and all these other things. Yeah. So, but there is a canonical mapping, and you hear something out of the blue, that's the way you're going to tend to understand it. And there's a canonical mapping between an interrogative and one of these questions under discussion, which is going to constrain how you interpret everything else that comes thereafter. And there's a correlation between these imperatives and the understood goals and intentions of the interlocutors. Paul calls them the interlocutor's to-do list. Okay, I have a slightly different take, but it's keeping. So we have these correlations, and you might say that then issuing an assertion, or posing a question, or issuing a direction are speech acts. Okay, that we canonically do with utterances of particular grammatical moods, but sometimes, given context, we can use them in different ways. But these are types of speech acts, and they actually correlate with particular ways, features of what we call the context of utterance. The context of utterance is not just a grab bag of propositions or information. It's organized, and it comes to bear on interpretation in particular ways that are reflected formally in, like the thing about prosody, is something that reflects the question under discussion. What's relevant? The relevant set of alternatives. That's really interesting. By the way, every language has prosodic focus. This is it's realized in different ways. We don't always do it with accent the way we do in English. Sometimes it's a higher, lower pitch and pitch angle, etc. But every language that I saw, and I did a lot of work on this, that I could find has prosodic focus, and it's always sensitive to the question under discussion. It's a more complex and interesting feature than that, but it's always sensitive to the set of alternatives that the question under discussion imposes on the context. So that suggests that the linguistic utterances are in very conventional ways sensitive to and pertain to the way our utterances should be understood as speech acts. Yeah. Now remember, we had trouble with Searle with that. We couldn't find a clear correlation between the formal content, the semantic content of an utterance, and the Searlean speech act. But now there is a canonical correlation between these different grammatical moods and some features of the utterances themselves, like focus, and we'll see anaphora too if we talk about it. There's some correlations between these actual conventional features of the utterance and the canonical speech acts that they're used to perform. And we see that the discourse context, the context of utterance itself, is structured. It has a common ground, a set of questions under discussion, a set of a to-do list, or understood goals and intentions. And these come to bear on interpretation and constrain what you can be reasonably, cooperatively meant to mean in a given context. That starts to give you a feeling for that notion of a speech act, and its relationship to linguistics is constrained, and hence it has some predictive power in very specific formal ways. Is that helpful?
Yeah, for sure. A lot of stuff there. So yeah, just quickly on Searle's taxonomy, as I recall it, there's there's 5 basic categories, and really there's 3 assertives, expressives and declarations are really all kind of indicatives,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
he separates them out into three separate categories
And
because of the direction of fit. I
promises
think
are
with different.
indicative too. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, and maybe some under commissives too, and
yeah.
well, yeah. So
Yeah.
then
You remember the
uh,
taxonomy better than I do.
directives. Yeah, yeah, but yeah. So he thought that because you could separate things based on like their direction of fit, like mind to world and world to mind, and both in the case of declarations, that was warrant for another category of speech act. But I mean, maybe that's not so principled, or maybe it's better to have the more general categories as you laid them out. You know, of the basic three that are
Well,
pretty common instead of splintering them. Yeah.
you know, um, if I say to you, I'm willing to commit to going to the grocery store, and is that a permissive? I don't know. Is it, committed? I don't know. There's definitely an indicative sentence. But when I say it, it also has implications, if I'm honest and sincere, it has implications for the way you're going to understand my personal commitments and plans, right? So if you said to me, go to the grocery store, and I say yes, meaning I will, in that case, we add to my intent, plans and intentions, Craig's going to the grocery store. But if I say I'm committed, to going to the grocery store, then even though that's an indicative, I think, and it adds to the common ground, it also, I think, adds, because what it entails. It entails an addition to my set of personal commitments, and that's part of the point. Just because the canonical form of something is, or I hereby direct you to go to the grocery store. A long time ago, Carl Genet and other people in philosophy had argued that those are assertions. I hereby direct you to go to the grocery store is an assertion. I have just done that. I have directed you to do that. But if that's a true assertion and I'm sincere, then I am, and especially if I have any authority or power over you, or you want to please me for some reason, then that's going to, assuming you accept that, because you can reject directions and questions. So you say, I don't want to talk about that, or I refuse to do it. But if you accept it, then that assertion is true. And if you accept, if you're cooperative with me, then you're going to actually commit that to adding that plan and that intention. And we know that from your behavior. So just because it's an assertion doesn't mean it doesn't have implications in the right context for your understood goals and plans and intentions, just as if I had directly said, go to the grocery store, and you said yes, right? So the direction of fit is a complicated matter, right? So whether it's word to world or world to word, an assertion is supposed to be word to world, I think, and if I got it the right direction, and a directive is supposed to be world to word. You make the world fit the words, right? So there are two different directions: the commitment versus the adding something to the common ground. But one and the same utterance can result in both additions to the updates of our information. One world to word and one word to world. That's my point. Does that help a bit?
Yeah, no, I definitely see that. And then, so what about Searle's worry about? Well, okay, maybe we think that his taxonomy was a bit, off in certain ways, but the general approach, the speech act theory that he would try to sort of contrast with the more formal semantics. I mean, what do you think about there being that contrast, and that, like, I mean, his view that the pragmatic or speech act theory was the right way to approach language and meaning and so on?
Well, remember when we started this talking about the difference between formal semantics and pragmatics, that I said, well, there's literal content, and then there's the meaning that someone has in uttering something with that literal content. When I said the job of pragmatic, the semantics is to derive the literal content, and the job of pragmatics is to figure out in a given context, if I use that, what would we understand it to mean? So the difference between, semantic content, literal content, and meaning, speaker meaning when in use in a given context. Okay. I would say that one of the things that Searle was right about is that you can't reduce to the speech act issued by uttering something in a particular context to the semantic content of the utterance. We just illustrated that with 2 or 3 that, where one utterance could be used to mean different things in different contexts, like call me a taxi or something. Yeah. And or even whether something's an assertion versus an answer to a question, as John introduced to Bill. So I agree that you can't tell me the speaker's meaning of an utterance unless you know a lot of things really about the context of utterance. That's crucial. And so in that respect, yes, you can't reduce meaning to formal content, semantic content, literal meaning. But remember, Searle doesn't have a way of hooking, of relating, of constraining meaning by semantic content. He doesn't have anything to say about how the speech act arises. He just gives us lots of examples. But as many people have said, Mitch Green, as I illustrated him because I remember his work, showing that there's no consistent conventional triggers for particular speech acts. Okay. Whereas on the other hand, I have a theory that says, well, here's what we need independently motivated, what we need for, what the question, this notion of a question and question under discussion, and this notion of an imperative and its semantic content, its formal semantic content. These are independently motivated by the syntax semantics. Okay. Given that, if we structure our discourse context in such a way as to have questions and intentions and goals so understood formally, as in the case of indicatives, we have propositions, questions, we have sets of propositions. I didn't say, but an imperative, and Paul Portner, and I agree, and many other people before have argued that it denotes a certain kind of directed property directed, indexically directed at the addressee. Okay, so you have propositions, sets of propositions, and indexical properties. These are different semantic types of things, and those types are, again, linguistically motivated, but doggone it if they don't serve purposes well pragmatically, and that's the canonical function, to add to the common ground, to make an assertion, to add to the set of questions under discussion, to add to the intentions and goals and plans of the addressee, the target of the property, right? To the intention to realize that property, going to the grocery store, right? So here is a direct link between the independently motivated semantic content, the literal content, and the canonical or default use that you assume that it will have. But that canonical use is not part of the conventional content. It's just that it's that's that type, that semantic type, a property versus a proposition versus a set of propositions, is a natural type of thing to use to add to a set of goals, the goal of realizing that property, to add to a set of questions. That's what a set of questions is, a set, for the QUD, questions under discussion, to add to the common grounds, a set of propositions. So I have a way, or Paul, or anybody who adopts this, assumption that there are these default mappings to types of basic speech act, has a way of explaining why that would be the default. And then, of course, but you have to have lots of other factors to decide which speech act a speaker actually intends in using the utterance. Are they just answering the question, and hence it's not an assertion on the part of the speaker, but only the partial answer to the question? Is it a directive versus et cetera, et cetera? You have to look at the context to figure out exactly which of those canonical speech acts. Is it the canonical speech act or something else that the speaker intends? So Searle's right. It's not conventionally given, but it's conventionally constrained. It's ridiculous to answer the question, who did John introduce to Bill, by saying it's raining. It just doesn't suit, you know? It's not one of the answers to the question, who did Bill introduce to the party? Okay? So so we have a constrained, linguistically interesting account of the kinds of speech acts that typically we use different types of utterances to make, and why that's only reasonable if what you're going to say is relevant in the sense of contributing to that discourse in the direction that it was intended to go, given the topic of conversation. See? So Searle has no connection between linguistic content and semantic content and speech act, and we've got a pretty interesting one.
Right. Yeah. So like several things you have there that he doesn't really supply, right? Like, explaining what sort of answers are appropriate or felicitous and so on.
And when you can understand, when can you understand a given utterance to be a permissive versus an assertive versus a this versus a that, right? And I think it's quite complex. When I say, I don't say I promised to go to the grocery. You didn't say, will you go to the grocery? And I say yes, but I said, I'm really committed to going to the grocery. And so you might take that to be a commissive, even though it's an assertion. So you add it to the common ground, but you also, update the set of publicly evident Craige goals accordingly, right? So I've committed myself in a certain way that's parallel. And this is Paul Porter's point. Then now we know that Craige should go to the grocery if she's honest, yeah, and sincere, yeah. So you can make sense of how that comes to be a commissive, even though in its basic form, it's an assertion. It's an assertion that's also making a commitment. So it's not either or in the Gricean taxonomy now. And I didn't say there was no utility to his taxonomy, but it doesn't connect up with the linguistic data. Maybe there's some social utility, the kinds of things we use language to do, but it doesn't help us understand how we update context directly, given the semantic content. Okay.
Right. Yeah. Good. And then just one more thing about the pragmatics, formal semantics distinction here. Like, I mean, do you think there's a sort of sharp divide between the stuff that's okay? Here's the stuff that we're modeling according to our formal semantics theories, and okay, here's all the other stuff. Maybe some of that's pragmatics and so on. And there's a clear distinction there, or is there? Do you think there's like a significant overlap, or I mean, you know what I'm getting at? Like,
you can test these things, I said that when we use this prosodic prominence, I hate to just keep using it because it's an example that's on the table, so I hope it'll be helpful and useful. That I proposed, well, it has to do with the alternatives under discussion. And I told you that the question under discussion tells you something about the alternatives. So that makes a very clear prediction. This is formal. This is formal pragmatics. Okay, I have the formal semantics of John only introduced Sue to Bill, and I have the question under discussion. So I know that it's perfectly felicitous and relevant if the question under discussion is, who did John introduce to Bill? And you answer, John only introduced Sue to Bill, or just plain Sue. But it is not felicitous for if the question under discussion is, who did John introduce to Bill? And you say, John introduced Sue to Bill, or Bill. He introduced Bill to himself. That's the only thing you can make sense of, right? Okay, so that makes a prediction. It's just as formal as the semantics, okay? Now, that doesn't mean that I can make a prediction using those tools about when you're going to understand an utterance to be sarcastic, okay? The tools I've given you so far about the common ground, the questions under discussion, and the plans, goals, and imperatives that are evident to the interlocutors, that doesn't tell you when you're going to understand what I said. If I say, that was very nice versus that was nice, well, how did you understand the difference between them? Well, I curled my lip, I used a certain intonation, a facial expression. I don't have a story about that. Now, I'd say it's something about the way context influences interpretation, but I don't have a story about it. Okay. It's not that you couldn't ultimately have a theory of facial expression and intonation that might give you that, but I don't have that. So right now, if I say that's pragmatics, context, that's not formal pragmatics. Okay. I don't have a scientific theory of it. I cannot make predictions. So I want to say there are some pragmatics that is scientific, formal pragmatics. That's why I use that term for it, in the sense that it lets me make clear predictions that are falsifiable, right? I make predictions about what kinds of answers are felicitous given a particular question and a given common ground. But I can't make predictions about when you're going to understand me to be sarcastic, sincere, not sincere. I'm winking when I say it and then I say not. God knows all the things that we use to indicate insincerity or something, or when I'm exaggerating or not. Well, you know me, and I know if I always say, wow, that's superb, that's excellent. So if I say it's superb, it's excellent, that might not mean the same thing to you. It might be a kind of exaggeration that I'm prone to. Or here, the famous, kind of letters that I was talking to my husband the other day about how you understand letters of recommendation. And the classic British approach was very restrained. You never just glowed with praise for somebody. So, versus, the American contemporary, not just American, God, I would get letters from certain countries that I don't want to insult by mentioning them when I was on, let's say, the committee for accepting graduate students to my linguistics department. We would get these letters of recommendation from certain countries, and they were just like, every person this person wrote for was the best student you ever heard of. They were brilliant. Everything was great. And because it was always that way, you had no idea. It's this, inflation of praise. Whereas, I guess somebody was a really great physicist, and they applied to Princeton, and I can't remember now who it was. My husband knew. And they applied to Princeton from Oxford or Cambridge, where they had a great, undergrad program in physics. And the person who wrote the letter said, he's not bad, in the letter. It says he's not bad, and says a bunch of other stuff about his work. And so one person on the committee looks at the letter and says, he's not bad. That's faint praise, and he puts it aside. And somebody else on the committee looks at it and says, oh, no, my God, this guy's at Cambridge. He says he's not bad. That means he's great. But there's nothing in the formal content or the content. You have to know when somebody's exaggerating or when they're almost unnaturally restrained in their praise. You have to know that, right? But that's world knowledge in a certain way that I'm not prepared to codify. Yeah. And that's pragmatics, and it's part of meaning, but it's not what I'm trying to capture at this juncture in our understanding about when I talk about formal pragmatics. There are certain things that I can make very specific predictions about anaphora, prosody, response relevance, what speech act is intended, etc. How you understand a modal, auxiliary, etc., etc. These are the things that these are the things I've worked on, and I have very specific things to say about how that contextual architecture, I call it the architecture of interpretation, how context feeds interpretation, and how the resulting, the formal content of the utterance ultimately is intended to feed and update the context, and how the two interact in an ongoing way. That's formal pragmatics, okay? But I got nothing to say about exaggeration or sarcasm or, a lot of things like that. So yeah, I can make I'm being very clear about what my predictions are. Yes.
Right, that's fair, right? So if the theory is kind of clear and has clear predictions, then yeah, we don't need to. It's not like there's this ambiguous boundary there between
Right.
what's covered under your theory and other things. You're just not covering.
I know, pretty clear about what I'm predicting. I think most of the time, yeah. It doesn't mean I've checked them all. I mean, it's like in science, you have a hypothesis. Checking all the implications of that is a huge domain, and people are working on all these things now, and sometimes they come up with counterexamples or apparent counterexamples, and others not, So, yeah.
Right. Yeah, I did want to talk about some other things, including, something you've already mentioned in introducing some of the ideas here is thinking about propositions as like possible worlds or sets of possible worlds, or
Yeah.
the sets of possible worlds compatible with the proposition. And you're following Stalnaker and others in that approach. I mean, could you talk about this model a bit further? I mean, in particular, does this require any strong view about what possible worlds are, like as abstract objects, or well, I mean, how would you think about that, or is it just more of an idealization?
Well, first of all, just think about. Let's just start with the intuitions, because that's where I tend to start. Okay. I do really think that Stalnaker has a very powerful intuition in saying that when we get together to talk, effectively what he's saying is we get together to share information about the way things are. Now, we may be sharing false information, but ostensibly we're being sincere, right? Otherwise, we don't take each other seriously at all. Okay. So our ostensive goals in sharing information, in having engaging in discourse, is to share information about the way things are, and maybe to set up goals and intentions, ways that we hope the others will try to make the world fit the word. Okay, so we have these fit things that we're aiming for. We need to, but the beginning assumption is we don't know the way the world is. All right, and we can't assume that our interlocutors have all the intentions we might want them to have. Right? So we don't know the way the world is. Well, how do you model that? Okay. And wait a minute. And so in an assertion, this is Stalnaker, is a proposal about the way the world is. Okay. It's a proposal. If I say, I went to the grocery store this afternoon, it makes it there. Before I said that, there were possible ways, forget worlds, there were possible ways things might be in the very intuitive sense in which I stayed home all afternoon. Yeah, you didn't know. But when I said that, if you take me to be sincere and true, you're going to knock those ways things might be out of the running. Yeah, at least for the purposes of our conversation, unless you say, no, I don't believe you. We're going to act as if that's what happened. And then the rest of the conversation will take that as possible background. Okay? And so if the next thing you say is, oh, what did you buy there? Then we'll know we're talking about where I went, and that location was the grocery store. So there will be the grocery store, etc. Okay? So you have to have a way of modeling that. Yeah. So what are possible worlds? They're very abstract things. Yeah. And the way I think of a possible world is it's really a world, it's a world history, by the way, because when you start taking tense into account, you have to talk about, like I just said, I went. So it's not like I'm there now. It's not present, it's past. So it's this big long worm was the way somebody described it to me once, a world history. And at any given slice through the worm, anything that exists is there, and it has certain properties and not others. So you can describe, so a possible world is a totally abstract thing. But in the model, if you have a model of the way that possible things might be, in any given possible world or world history at a given slice, you have a list of the things that are there. Those are the entities in that world. That's what exists. That's your ontology for that moment in that world. And you have a list of all the properties that those entities have, right? And other relations between them, right? And that's the way you describe a possible world. Now, is that a thing you can put your hands on? No, but it's a way of like describing a Disneyland. You know what I mean? Like possible worlds are just different ways things might be. They're just imagine everything there might be, and then every property that those things might have at a given point. Very rich, very complex, And by having a model in which you just have this, you don't have to have the possible worlds as basic. You can model them in other ways, but just as very simple for the simple-minded like me. You just have a set of possible worlds, but you have a mapping from each possible world and the entities in it to their properties. Okay? That's what your model is. So it tells me that in world 1, I went to the grocery store, but in world 2, I stayed home. And when I tell you I went to the grocery store, if both those worlds were in our context set before, and you believe me or decide to behave as if, pretend that you believe me, then you're going to knock out the world in which I stayed home and keep world 1 where I went to the grocery store. All right? And because we have a model that tells us in 1, Craige went to the grocery and blah, 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 and that means she didn't stay home, then all afternoon anyway, then you have information that's modeled in that way. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to believe in possible worlds. It's just a way of modeling the information. David Lewis, when he talked about what's a meaning, said a meaning is just, if you want to know what something means, find something to model that, and find something that models that behaves as if that meaning were true. Okay, and that's what the meaning is. So we have these possible worlds, and doggone if they don't turn out to be very, very useful. They're very useful tools because you can talk about entailments. If I say, what did I do this afternoon? I went to the grocery store, and you and I know that the grocery store is on Amsterdam Avenue, then that entails, because that other information is in our common ground, that entails that I was on Amsterdam Avenue this afternoon. And there are other entailments, okay, that follow in a very elegant, logically elegant, coherent, consistent way. So modeling possible worlds with those model theoretic tools and set theory gives you a way of making very elegant predictions. And it turns out elegant predictions because there are multiple possible worlds you can possibly. Modals talk about how things might be. There are multiple ways things might be, but we don't know which one it is. But there are some ways that things might not be. If I went to Amsterdam Avenue this afternoon, it's damn sure that I also wasn't in San Francisco this afternoon because Amsterdam is in New York City, and I can't go presently in present day 2024. I can't be in the same two places in one afternoon on one day, right? So there are these possibilities are related to each other in interesting ways, and that lets you to start to talk about modal, meanings: would, should, might, could, and temporal changes over time. Okay, I have this property at one time, but not at another time. Now I got gray hair, didn't used to have it, etc. Yeah, so they just turn out to be extremely interesting. Are they real things? I don't know. But they show you about some things about the relations between meanings that are very illuminating, including their entailments and so forth and so on. That's it. That's what possible worlds are, as far as I know. Yeah. But we intuitively, I just want to say, we have these hunches about what a possible world is. It's just a Disneyland way we things might be in the world as we know it. That's typically how we really have hunches about them, right?
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, because I could see a worry that some people might have is that, well, because a somewhat common way to think about possible worlds is like maximally consistent sets of propositions, maybe with further constraints, but something like that. But if we think about them like that, then it's sort of something going to be sort of circular. If we think about, well, a proposition is some sort of sets of possible worlds, but a possible world is some set of propositions, then run into problems there. So we'd have to maybe think about possible worlds in another way than that.
You have to think about
but
relations.
maybe we still have an intuitive idea.
Yeah, that's right. And the way that you model the properties of entities in a possible world. Yeah.
Okay,
but like I said, you could take propositions to be the primitives instead of possible worlds. My colleague Carl Pollard has a whole theory like that, and then model possible worlds in a different way. But this is a very useful, simple way, the way that it's been classically done by Lewis and Stalnaker and Montague and a variety of other people. And it's very elegant and works quite well for a wide variety of things.
Okay, good. Yeah, so just a couple of potential concerns then about this approach. One is that I was thinking, okay, what about propositions that are maybe like necessarily equivalent? Maybe they're logically equivalent, but different in meaning. So I don't know, different mathematical statements. Maybe they're all
Oh
necessary,
yeah,
but
yeah.
they're
Oh,
not the same statement. They mean different things.
no, that's great. That's great. So 2 + 2 is 4 is true in all possible worlds. So is the square root of 4 is 2. But intuitively, they don't. They're both true in all possible worlds, but they don't have the same meaning. You can know one and not know the other. So intuitively, their content, their conceptual content, when we interact with them, when we grasp them, it's not the same meaning. So this is classic stuff. I mean, it's not like, point well taken. I mean, it's not like Possible Worlds answers all the classical problems that were raised by, say, Frege right at the outset, right? No. But remember, I did distinguish between I'm not going to give you the answer to that question. I don't have the answer to that question. But if I did note at the outset that there's a difference between semantic content and meaning. Remember, semantic content is something that's given to you as the conventional literal content. And meaning is something richer that involves its relationship between the utterance and the context. And so the answer, the 2 + 2 is 4 is not the answer to what is the square root of 4. But 2 is the square root of 4 is. So right there, there's some difference in meaning in the sense that one can be used to answer that question and the other one cannot. Why is that? Yeah. So that has to do with what the sentences are about, their parts in some sense, right? That the being the square root is something that the 2 is the square root of 4 is about, but it's not something that 2 + 2 is 4 is about. Yeah, that's so they're both about 4 and 2, but that square root relation versus the sum relation are very different relations. And so one way in which they differ in meaning is that one can contribute information that will resolve this one question while the other cannot. All right? Now, we don't have an adequate theory yet of what that is, but I think that's the key. My personal feeling is that's the key to understanding the difference in meaning. It's that you don't reduce meaning to possible worlds. I start off by saying you can't reduce meaning to possible worlds, right? I said semantic content does not reduce to, meaning cannot reduce to semantic content. So just because the meaning of an assertion is a set of possible worlds, just because the semantic content of an assertion, of an indicative sentence is a set of possible worlds, that's a proposition, that doesn't mean it's its meaning. How it can be used and how it can be understood to contribute to the context. Those differ. Okay? So I think that's the approach that I take and have taken again and again to these classic puzzles about meaning versus formal content. And I ultimately think that the puzzle about things that denote are both necessarily true might yield to that. Okay. But I don't have that answer yet, and I haven't made that argument in the full generality. I just want to point out that there's an opening there. Okay?
Yeah. Yeah, that seems reasonable. Although I could see someone being worried that, but even if, we agree that maybe there's more to say about meaning, but these necessarily true statements all have the same semantic content. That still seems like a bit of a bullet to bite on its own.
Wait a minute.
Is that not a consequence?
The utterance as a whole is a set of propositions, but it has lots of content in its parts. Okay. And who's to say that those don't contribute in a certain way to meaning? Okay. Even if they aren't the semantic content of the whole. Okay. So these are subtle differences, but there is a difference in general between semantic content and meaning. And I would say that the meanings of the semantic contents of the parts might contribute to meaning. Yeah. I certainly know that they do with topicality, So, who does Bill like? Sue, he likes. It would be strange to answer who does Bill like with Bill is liked by Sue. I mean, Bill is who likes Sue. Yeah. So I didn't do that well. Let's try it again. Who does Bill like? And here's two different possible answers. So you know the question. It's nice to say Sue he likes. It sounds a little in a certain kind of style. We used to call that Yiddish movement, where you'd move the object to the beginning of the sentence and make it topic-like. Yeah, but here it's focus-like. It's fine to say Sue he likes, but it's odd to say Bill is who likes Sue. That's weird. Why? Yeah. So there are things, they both mean exactly the same thing. Bill is who likes Sue, and Sue is Sue Bill likes. Both mean that Bill and Sue stand in the like relation, with Bill as the liker and Sue as the likee. So the same set of possible words, but they're used in different contexts, one felicitously, not the other in the same context. And there are many complex features of utterances that do bear on felicity in context. Now, again, all I'm doing is showing you that there's a difference, there's an opening between the content of the whole and its meaning, and that might take into account the contents of parts and their particular structure.
Yeah, and then other things like context and pragmatics and stuff.
Context is crucial for meaning. Yeah. You don't reduce. See what here? Let me make another point. We have no prima facie. See, this distinction that I've been making, which is not mine. This is in the field, but I try to be particularly careful about it. The difference between semantic content, which is what formal semantics gives you, compositionality, putting the parts together in a regular way given the syntax, that's semantic content. The distinction between that and the meaning of an utterance. It's an extremely important distinction, but it's a theoretical distinction, Troy. It's not a pre-theoretic distinction. So when Frege was talking about the meanings of these utterances and why could one be true and, or we know one but not the other, why could you know that 2 + 2 is 4 but not know that 2 is the square root of 4? Well, that's because they have different meanings. Well, for him, a meaning is a meaning is a meaning. And that's what Chomsky was saying when it's too hard to get a handle on meanings. Well, you can get a good handle on compositional semantic content, but you need much more to get at meaning. Okay. And the whole point is we don't have pre-theoretic intuitions about where the line is. I said I draw a clear line in my theory between them. Different people might draw different lines. Some people might want something that I said was pragmatic. In fact, this happens all the time. Something I say is pragmatic, they might want to put in what the syntactic level of logical form, right? So it's actually given compositionally as part of this semantic content. And I'd say, no, I don't think that's right. Now I have arguments. I have to argue it on the basis of empirical evidence, context in which it isn't felicitous, in which it could or could not be taken to be true, in which it could or could not, etc. Have other aspects of its meaning, and I have to argue that you can't get that from the syntax, right? But all I'm saying is different people may have different theories that draw the line between semantic content and meaning, which is partly pragmatic, in different places. So my point is you don't have a pre-theoretic distinction between meaning and semantic content. It's not pre-theoretical. So when you talk about your intuitions, the only thing that you can reasonably, as a scientist, say you have access to is your intuitions about the meaning of something in a given context. And you'd better control for context, because you might think something means one thing, but I can give you a context in which it means something else, which suggests that you don't want to predict that the meaning that you thought it had is its semantic content, right? Because it's sensitive to context in a way you hadn't foreseen. You have to take that into account. Yeah. So taking that into account, then that means that all you have is your pre-theoretic semantic intuitions, but you can refine those by putting the utterance in context and seeing if it might have a context in which it has a different interpretation. So that's one thing that we work at very hard in formal pragmatics, is saying, your intuitions about meaning are intuitions about the meaning conveyed by the use of the semantic content in a given context. And remember, when we were talking about speech acts, I kept giving you context in which one and the same utterance could be taken to be one speech act in one context and another one in a different one, right? So that's the tool I'm using again and again as a formal pragmaticist. I have kinds of context in mind, and those are very formally defined. And then if I can show you that this means different things in different contexts, that argues strongly that the distinctions in meanings you are attested that go along with your intuitions can't be explained just in conventional terms. You have to look at context and how it influences interpretation. So again, this is all very empirical. We have to give very careful arguments based on very rich data sets. Right? So, yeah, but we have a distinction, and our theory makes it, between semantic content and meaning. And that, I think, is what opens the door to many puzzles in the philosophy of language.
Right. Well, there's, of course, work to be done there if you want to have a fuller theory of meaning and so on.
I could work till I was 100 and I wouldn't finish this. You know, that's the nature of the beast. It's very complex.
Right. Yeah. So, and just one more thing about possible world stuff. So, you might worry that a possible worlds account of propositions leaves out actual part of the semantic content. Well, maybe you might not count this as part of the semantic content, but see what you have to say. Having to do with probabilities. Propositions typically, or at least frequently, carry probabilities, information about probabilities of different possibilities, not merely about like what's compatible with it and what's not. So I don't know. Maybe you want to talk about that. Would that be included as part of the?
Well, first of all, possible worlds are not incompatible with talking about things in terms of probabilities. I mean, I don't do that because that's not in my tool set. You know, that really sort of came to prominence more in the last 20 years, and especially out of young philosophers like Sarah Moss and Eric Swanson, and there's a variety of. Now, most of the young good philosophers of language now use probabilities as part of their tools for understanding what utterances mean. That's not incompatible with possible worlds. You could say that some possible worlds are more probable than others given certain attested features of the way things are, right? And you could then use those probabilities as part of the semantic content of an utterance. So several people, Dan Lasseter in Linguistics and Eric Swanson and Sarah Moss in Philosophy of Language, argued that you want a probabilist account of epistemic modality, for example. I think Sarah Moss and Dan Lasseter really, all three of them, and Eric Swanson and others assume that is the case, have done a good job of arguing that for some epistemic modals, that this modal elements of natural language, you want to consider probabilities. But I'm not yet convinced that you want to reduce the interpretation of modal elements to probabilist terms. And I mean, that's a really complex argument. I'm not sure I want to try to make it today, but I want to say that it's when you look at it's probably raining, or it's surely raining, or it's likely that it's raining. Those are much more probabilistic in their semantic content in some way. And Sarah Moss has more to say about that than anybody I know. That's, and those are much more probabilistic in their semantic content, meaning taking into account probabilities, than it might be raining or it must be raining. I have a recent paper on might and must, and I don't believe that those are probabilistic. I don't make that argument specifically, but I give what I hope is an account that addresses some of the problems that some of the probabilists might have raised for that account of those epistemic modal auxiliaries, might and must. But when it comes to probably and likely and surely, I think Sarah and Dan and Eric are almost surely probably right. But I don't have anything. I mean, again, they've said interesting things about it, but it's perfectly compatible with doing it in possible worlds terms. You could say that in one world, X is more probable than Y. In another world, Y is more probable than X. And if we decide that it's probably, X, then we're going to get rid of worlds where the other probability obtains, right? Which doesn't entail that it's true. It's just that the probability is probably a relation between possible worlds that tells you, given the world we're in, it's more likely that it's this world, that world, that world. But again, I'm not going to go into the details of modeling that, but you can do it with possible worlds. Okay? It's just that you have different kinds of relations. I hope that's helpful. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Maybe it's different sorts of relations. Maybe it's some sort of probability distribution across them, or I mean.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have very strong views about how to model that properly. I mean, so I'm bumbling here, except I know you can do it with possible worlds. Now, if you have something better than possible worlds for some other reason, and it can do all the things that possible worlds have done and do for us, I'm on board. Show me. Okay. But I haven't seen it. And I've seen that these are flexible enough to be used for some of the probabilistic accounts. So, yeah.
Right. It's the best sort of model you've found to date. Maybe there's something better.
It's a good way of modeling this stuff, and that's models are never perfect. I'm not saying they are the meanings. They're models of meanings, but they get it so much and they're so rich and they make such interesting predictions that I think we can say they're pretty useful models. So you give me a better one, I'll talk to you. Okay?
Fair enough. Just one thing there before we move on. You mentioned the epistemic modal auxiliaries like might and must. And that's one thing you've talked about before, how, well, they might not function exactly the way you might expect a sort of modal verb to function. It's not necessarily just, well, it must be this. Is not just semantically equivalent to, well, it's necessarily the case that this. So maybe if you want to talk a bit more about that and how this functions a bit differently.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes, that's right. First of all, let me just say that all the very important work on modal logic that comes out of the philosophical logic tradition is the foundation for what Montague did in using modals and his way of modeling semantics of the modal auxiliaries: would, could, might, should, will, has to. All these are modal auxiliaries, and some of them, like should, are deontic. Some of them are epistemic, like might, must, may, etc. But all of them have their foundation. The foundation of the formal semantics of them comes from this crucial work on the logic of modality. Okay, modal logic. Let's just say that all of that's crucial. But now we're talking about natural language semantics and not the semantics of a made-up formal logic. Okay, a logic is a language that's interpreted. We tell you what the interpretation is when we make up the language. Yeah, that's what my best logic teachers always taught me. Nino Kokiro, great guy, student of Montague, my first logic teacher. So, but in natural language, we have to discover what they mean. Are they properly modeled using notions from modal logic, right? Montague claimed they are, and he showed that doing so gives you certain interesting predictions that are at least close to what some of them mean, right? So that's a good foundation. At least it's a good place to start, okay? Let's put it that way. But now I think really within the whole field of modal semantics, whether you're looking at philosophy of language or semantics, linguistic semantics, the close fields, very close, lots of crossover. You kind of have to be both if you're going to do one or the other, especially if you're talking about modal stuff. There are very interesting features of these modal auxiliaries as they're used in natural language that make them much richer than just the modal logic operators of necessity and possibility. Okay, so you can say that the modal force of must and should and etc. is necessity, and the modal force of might and could is possibility. But there's clearly more to say about them than that, right? So what is the difference? And of course, they have epistemic versus deontic logic. There are different accessibility relations between worlds. If you say it might be raining, then in your set of possible worlds, you're predicting that among them are worlds in which it's raining. We don't know if that's the real world, but so there's some accessibility relation to those worlds that's predicted. Okay, and but it's more interesting than that in context. So in a given context, if somebody says, given what I know, it might be raining. That might be true in a sense, but that's only because I don't know better, right? Given what I know, it might be raining. I see all these wet umbrellas and people coming in wet. But the rest of you know, but I don't, because the rest of you have seen the closed system camera that has a picture of the outside, and you see that there's somebody with a hose out there drenching everybody before they come in, and the sky is completely clear and there's no rain. So, given what I know, it might be raining may be true, but it might be raining is false from the point of view of people who are better informed or informed in a different way, right? And also, it turns out that so there's some sense in which when we use the auxiliary might, the epistemic modal might, in context in natural language, we intend as a speaker, we mean for that to be constrained in its interpretation as a function of certain other assumptions, like given what I know. Or there may be some long contextual set of assumptions. I can say, well, suppose that, we see that we don't have a window to the outside, and suppose that everybody who comes in is drenched, and suppose that, that the umbrellas are wet, then, I think it's reasonable to assume it might be raining. Now, I'm not assuming that it might be raining. I'm assuming that if we take all these premises, these hypothetical assumptions to be true, then the set of possible worlds that we get would include worlds where it's raining. It might include other worlds where there's somebody out there with a hose drenching people. So I can't be sure just on the basis of those hypothetical assumptions. But there are worlds in that set of hypothetical ground, right? It's not a real context set because we haven't assumed that those things are true. But it's just like, in a natural deduction system, you make a set of hypothetical assumptions. From that, you can draw a dependent conclusion, right? But it's contingent on the truth of those assumptions. So if some of them are false and we don't know they're true, we can't just assume it generally. So that's a case that in which there's some other contextual factors that are not what anybody knows, but what we're assuming for the purposes of a hypothetical assumption that would restrict the set of worlds in which we're considering what the possibilities are, right? And turns out if you say, John believes it might be raining, the default in that case is you're going to assume that the set of worlds in which it might be raining is the worlds consistent with John's beliefs. Typically, when you embed a modal auxiliary as the complement of an attitude predicate, John says it might be raining. Well, I'm not committed at all. Maybe John's even lying. Or John knows that it's raining. Well, then that assumes that it is true, because knows is factive, they say. It presupposes that the complement's true. Yeah. So it matters what predicate it's embedded under, but when it's something like believes or suspects or something like that, then the agent of the attitude, in this case John, the subject of the main clause, is going to be the one whose evidence one is going to take to be the set of assumptions in given which the complement may be true. Okay? And there are many other more complex contexts in the if you say if the umbrellas are wet, it might be raining. Well, we don't know if the umbrellas are wet, but I'm saying given everything else we know, then if the umbrellas are wet, it's possible that it's raining. So conditional antecedents play a bearing. Or if the water to the building is turned off and the umbrellas are wet, it must be raining. So I'm assuming by saying, if we can have that hose out there and the umbrellas are wet, then the only way I can reconcile that with the other information that I have is that it's raining. Yeah. So there, the conditional antecedent makes a huge difference to what we can conclude. And so there are very complex environments we can construct where it might be raining has a very different set of information to convey. In other words, it's the domain over which may ranges, the set of worlds in which we're saying, given that set of worlds as the set of ways things might be, either actually or hypothetically or conditionally, right? Given that domain of possible worlds, at least one of them is a world in which it's raining. Okay? So that general perspective is one that comes from work by Angelika Kratzer, who was doing this work in the early 80s. She worked with Max Cresswell in philosophy and logic, as well as with von Steckow in linguistics in Germany, and ultimately came to UMass and influenced my work deeply. She was on my committee. And she's had a profound influence in philosophy of language as well as in linguistics in talking about the way that the use of a natural language auxiliary, modal auxiliary, or modal element of any sort presupposes what she calls a modal base, but it's really this domain, that's contextually given domain of possibilities. It might be a set of, given by, for example, these set of contingent possibilities, hypothetical possibilities, conditional possibilities, right? Or the information that a particular agent has or think they have. Yeah? Those are all each of those is a modal base, hypothetical, contingent, or it could be our context set. If I just say it might be rain, I expect you to assume on the basis of our context set that there's a possible world in which it's raining. But you have to get that from context. Yeah? You have to get that from context. And similarly, not just epistemic modal auxiliaries, but deontics, like should. If you think that abortion is murder, you shouldn't have an abortion, right? So there, the contingent assumption is that there's an ethical prohibition that abortion is murder. And then given that on the assumption that murder is unethical, that's not stated in that conditional, but it's typical that people will assume that. Then given that, you would assume that you shouldn't have an abortion because it would be unethical, right? So once again, should assumes a modal base that's partly ethical assumptions that we assume to be common in our common ground, and then the hypothetical assumption with which you may or may not agree that abortion is murder, right? Okay, so it turns out all natural language modals make these contextual assumptions about the assumed ground with respect to which you are supposed to take. That's the ground, the domain, set of possible worlds in which you're supposed to say that either there is a possible world that's of this character or all possible worlds are of this character, but only in that domain. Like, I did not commit myself when I said, if you think abortion is murder, you shouldn't have an abortion. I didn't commit myself to it being unethical to have an abortion, because I may or may not believe that abortion is murder, right? So all these, so this sheds light on such a wide range of phenomena in the semantics and of natural language, modal auxiliaries and other modal elements, and the meanings of conditionals, which are, it's huge domain in logic and philosophy of language, which it just, Crotzer's work didn't turn it upside down, but she just turned it 180 degrees to look at it from a completely different angle. And there are scores of dissertations and papers in the best journals that have been written shedding new light on classic phenomena and puzzles as a consequence of making this assumption about the modal auxiliaries. I have a particular story about them that I've written about recently, but it's completely within that Crotzerian vein, and it attempts to address some interesting problems that in the philosophy of language remain, I think, still contentious and unresolved. It remains to be seen whether people will rally around my perspective. But so it's a very interesting area in which there's a lot of engagement right now between the philosophy of language and linguistic semantics. Did I address your question? Sorry, Troy.
No, that was good. Yeah, that was right. I was asking you about the epistemic modal auxiliaries.
Yeah.
And how those can sometimes function. Yeah, it can be quite complicated, perhaps.
Right. So the point is, but you have to have a theory of context that predicts in which context it's possible to get which domain, because you usually don't have a puzzle about what the domain of application the speaker intends for you to use to judge the truth of their statement. Yeah. And how do you know that?
And you typically can't. Right, and you typically can't read off a domain from, well, if you didn't have access to the context.
No. Even the if clause that I used, and I said, if abortion is murder, you also had to assume that murder was unethical in order to restrict the domain of should appropriately. Because if murder is sometimes ethical, if killing a combatant, an enemy in war is ethical, then murder is not always unethical, and it doesn't follow. So you have to, there are so many things that have to be assumed about the context in order to make sense of what I'm asserting there and why it should be true. Yeah. So even when some of it's explicit, like with the if clause, typically it's not all explicit.
Right. Yeah, so I did want to move on to a few other things. So you had an article with Mandy Simons on presupposition, triggering, and projection, among other things. So in that article, you offer an account of
That's just about to come out any day now in linguistics. Yeah. Sorry, I said it's just about. I'm getting a punch for that. It's about to come out in linguistics and philosophy. I'm very excited about this paper. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, great! I thought it was already up. I guess
it's out in preview.
But yeah,
it's about to come out. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. But yeah, but in that, you and Mandy offer an account of how presuppositions are triggered with language, how projection works, and so on. Do you mind laying some of the groundwork for this paper? Like, what are presupposition, triggering, and projection?
Sure. Well, in a way, everybody knows what presuppositions are. So my favorite is this old diehard example. We're in court, and I'm on the stand, and you're the attorney, and you ask me, "Have you stopped beating your husband?" Okay, so I can't say yes. I can't say no without conceding that I at least used to beat my husband. Yeah. So I would incriminate myself if I answered that directly. Why? Because the question presupposes that I used to beat my husband, right? So that's a presupposition. And I just mentioned factives. So no, John believes that it's raining. When I say that may be true. My assertion is true. It doesn't commit me to it being true that it's raining. But if I say John knows that it's raining, typically you take that to mean that I think it's raining, because knows is factive. It commits the speaker to the truth of the compliment. It's a little more complex than that, because if it's multiply embedded, it can commit. So Stephen says that John knows that it's raining, commits Stephen to believing that it's raining. Okay, not me, but okay. But basically, it's a factor. So it commits the truth of the complement projects to be taken to be true in a way that it doesn't with beliefs. You see the difference. That's one kind of presupposition, and very commonly interpreted. And have you stopped? Stop is one of those things. It's not an attitude predicate, but stop is a change of state verb. You can't stop doing something you haven't been doing. It's just conceptually, part of what it is to understand to stopping. That it's a conceptual precondition of stopping, that you were doing the thing. Okay. So it strongly presupposes that it was done prior. And so these things are presuppositional. They trigger presuppositions, and they don't go away. They're different than the semantic content of the complement, because they don't go away under negation. If I say John doesn't know that it's raining, by that, even though it's under the scope of negation over the main verb, it's like it's not the case that John knows that it's raining. So negation has wide scope over the whole shebang. It still implies that it's raining. It's just that John doesn't know it. Yeah. And John hasn't stopped beating his wife strongly implies that he used to or has been beating his wife, even though, again, it's not the case that he has stopped beating his wife. So you put negation over it. Similarly, so typically when you put negation over the scope of some utterance, the semantic content is not asserted to be true by the speaker, right? It's not raining. It's not the case that it's raining. I'm not asserting that it's raining is true. Au contraire, right? That it's false. So semantic content does not persist under the scope of negation. Yeah, it doesn't persist under interrogation. Is it raining? Doesn't commit me to it being true that it's raining. And similarly, does John believe that it's raining? Doesn't commit me to it being true that it's raining. But does John know that it's raining? Again, seems to imply that I think it's raining, and I wonder if John knows. Has John stopped beating his wife? Again, seems to imply that he has been, as far as I'm concerned. I presuppose he has been, but I'm wondering if he stopped, etc. So these are operators: negation, interrogation, put in a conditional, which typically block entailment. Anything under the scope of negation or the interrogation is not entailed by what I said. I'm not committed to it. It's true. It's true. But presuppositions persist under interrogation and negation, and in conditionals, typically in the antecedent of a conditional. So why? Why would that be? We call that projection. We say the presupposition projects. Okay? This is a classic problem in linguistics and philosophy of language. How does that work? And there are lots of theories about it. I could lecture you for 2 hours about the background theories, but there are problems with all those accounts. Okay. And Mandy and I have argued that with those kinds of presuppositions, the reason that know is a presupposition trigger, but believe is not, the reason that stop is a presupposition trigger, but begin is not, is that it is a conceptual precondition on, let's look at discover. It's better than know. Did John discover that it's raining? It's a conceptual precondition on discovering something that thing is true. You can't discover it if it isn't true. It's a conceptual precondition on stopping something that it was going on. You can't stop it if it wasn't happening. Okay? So when you have it's a conceptual precondition. It's an ontological precondition. It's stronger than that. That you cannot have. There's no existence of a state of discovering something when the thing itself did not already exist. It's an ontological precondition on that kind of event occurring. It's an ontological precondition on stopping that the event in question, the complement in question was going on. You can't stop doing something if it's not already true. And we look at a wide range of cases. Like look at a different kind of case, kick. If you say John kicked the tree, that presupposes that John is the sort of thing that has a foot or a foot-like appendage. Yeah? Why should that be? Well, it's what kicking is. It's an ontological precondition on kicking something that you got to have a foot-like appendage. That's it. Doing it with a fist doesn't count. Butting heads doesn't count. You have to have a foot-like appendage. And there's a wide range of other kinds of cases where and so what we're trying to explain is, why those what we call presupposition triggers, know, discover, stop, kick, why they are presupposition triggers. Well, they're things that have certain ontological preconditions. Yeah? And then why would that make it a precondition trigger? And then we talk about what the content, the semantic content of the trigger is, as opposed to its background content. And that there's a difference between semantic foreground content and background content. And that we tend to take the background content to be presupposed. And there's a reason for that. And it comes from the probable utility of my utterance. If I don't assume and take it that you'll find it reasonable to assume that John is a smoker, and I ask you, has John stopped smoking? That's a relatively low utility question if part of the answer to the question could be no, because he never did, right? It has much higher utility. We're going to get a lot more information if we assumed to begin with that John was a smoker and then did or did not quit, right? Then the yes or no is more informative. Okay, so we draw on actual probability theory and what's, the probable utility of the utterance to explain why, in the absence of certain other contextual factors, the background assumptions are taken to be presupposed by the speaker. And hence, presuppose means they're not at issue, so the negation doesn't have scope over them. We're assuming that the thing is true, that did you discover that it's raining? We taking it to be true that it's raining, so that the ontological precondition of discovery obtains. Then the more high utility question: Did John discover that it's raining? No, John didn't discover that it's raining, or did John discover that it's raining? Both the interrogative and the negation are cancel the entailments of the utterance. But they don't cancel presuppositions, because the very question itself is only high utility if we presuppose as background that it is true. Okay. So the negation doesn't have scope over the presupposed portion. The interrogation doesn't have scope over that. It's asking for the narrower question of assuming that high utilities, that the presupposition is true. Did this occur? So there's a lot of nice features of that. No, nobody else has proposed that account. There's a lot of nice features of that. One of them is, not only does it predict why, nobody before has had a theory which predicts which linguistic elements should be presupposition triggers and which not. I like the story, it's not like, God made a vocabulary for a natural language. And he said, okay, vocabulary is out there in the field. He's about to send it out down to earth to be a language for the humans that he's created. He said, okay, before you go, some of you are going to carry presuppositions. Now, you, and you go over there, and Michael's going to give you presuppositions to carry, and you just go over there and go on down to work. It's not like that. It's not arbitrary. It's not these have these presuppositions for a reason that arises from the meaning of the elements themselves. So we have an account of why presupposition triggers are presupposition triggers. Moreover, remember, the account makes assumptions about the utility of the question given background assumptions. But Mandy and I had worked with a crew, David Beaver and Judith Tannhauser, for, since 2008 on a series of National Science Foundation grants in the US to study the nature of presupposition projection and when it projects and what kind of contextual factors predict that it will or will not project. And one of our findings from that is that triggers differ significantly in and of themselves about how likely their presuppositions are to project, A, and B, that those things project or do not project partly as a function of the context and in particular the question under discussion, which we've been talking about earlier today. So that presuppositions don't always project. You have to know something about the context to assume that they will, okay? Well, how's that that would be incompatible with a theory that just said, look, certain things just as a fact have presuppositions, and when they have them, they project from under negation and interrogation. That doesn't say that projection A arises because of the meaning of the utterances, of the trigger itself, and B is the projection is contingent on context. Okay. But our theory can predict that. It can explain why a question might, in a certain context, not be taken to presuppose the background content, the ontological precondition. So again, explaining that to you would require going through lots of complex examples, but that's what we do in the paper. So we argue that we have a more empirically adequate account because we can explain when it doesn't arise. And we can also, it's more satisfying because we can explain which things are triggers, or we predict which are. And there's a whole other feature of it that I didn't mention, which is that starting with Emerita Heim, the presuppositions of features like, of triggers like know, discover, stop, and these things like kick are of the same nature as anaphoric presuppositions. Remember, we started off by talking about how you can't understand what I mean when I say he has on a navy shirt if you don't take me to presuppose a most salient male entity. All right. So he typically it's taken to be a male gendered entity that's salient in context. And without that presupposition being satisfying, if I say it to you out of the blue, you're like, what I don't know what you're talking about. Then we're at Samuel Beckett territory, right? Where novels start by saying he was lost or something. Well, they do that for a reason. You're supposed to make you lost, right? But it's not felicitous in natural language. That's the point. Okay, so that's a kind of presupposition, right? And Heim has a story, beautiful story. We don't have time to go into it. Beautiful story where she puts those anaphoric presuppositions together with the factives and the things like kick, and says, here's an account of how context changes that will explain when presupposition resolution, satisfaction of the presupposition is available in context, right? But my work with David Beaver and Mandy Simons and Judith Tannhauser showed that there are different features between the anaphoric presuppositions and the others, the factives and ones like kick. And Heim's account is right in the sense that you want a dynamically changing context that makes the satisfaction available in the same way across the different kinds of presupposition, but they have to be triggered differently and operate differently to explain the difference between the anaphoric and non-anaphoric ones. And the original account couldn't do that, but my new one with Mandy Simons can. So it was something we've been working on for near 20 years. And so that's why I smile real big when I talk about it. Right? I'm very happy that we were able to, we laugh and say we fought over it for 18 years and that's why we got it through review, Not just between us, but with Mandy and with David and Judith and with a whole crew of people that we talked about in various lectures and seminars, told us all the counterexamples to the earlier versions of the theory.
No, that's good. And then you progressively got to where you are now with that. So yeah. Great. I do want to ask something else about the connection between like semantics and ontology.
Yeah.
And in particular, we might wonder like when and how much ontology or ontological commitment we can be read off or inferred from just the semantics of natural language.
Yeah.
So this is especially relevant in debates regarding ontological commitment, philosophy of like mathematics, and so on. I take it you're rather conservative in how much ontology can be read off from the semantics. I don't know. Maybe you can talk a bit more about the
Yeah,
issues here and what sort of views you've taken on this.
yeah. So, first of all, I should say one of my teachers was Emin Bach. He's a linguist, Emin Bach, and he talked about what he calls natural language ontology, which is if you're going to give an adequate semantics for natural language utterances, you have to assume that certain expressions refer to things like the sky. So there has to be a thing, the sky. If you're going to have a model for that, and when it's true, when I say there's truth to saying right now, the sky is blue. Yeah, that is true out my window. Yeah. So there has to be a way of modeling that. So there has to be a sky that can have the property of being blue. But what the hell is the sky? Really? Is there a thing there? Is there a dome? Is it a perception? No, it's not really a percept. What is that? I don't know. I really don't know. And I don't really want to make any commitments when I talk about it. So that's what Emin was saying. We have to have a natural language ontology. Natural language makes us assume that certain things exist in some way in order to model the way the language works. But we should be conservative about what that tells us about the way the world actually is. Okay. And I actually did a seminar with my colleague, Stuart Shapiro, he's a logician and philosopher at Ohio State. We did a seminar with linguists and philosophers and metaphysicians about natural language ontology and had a lot of fun talking about that. There's a lot of interesting questions about time. Does time exist? Do events exist? There are interesting questions about, of course, possible worlds. No question, the questions you asking me earlier, do those exist? But also numbers and plurals. So it can be true, it seems, that the earrings are new, but the silver in the earrings is old. Yeah. Where's the difference between them? Are they two different things? Well, you can model. Gerda Hardlink and Emin Bach talked about this at great length, and you can model there's a count domain with earrings in them. Those are count things. You can say I have two earrings, but there's a mass domain, which is the stuff in the world, and there's a mapping between the stuff and the things. So there's a mapping between the earrings and the silver in the earrings, and so they're different entities in a sense, and they can have different properties accordingly in your model because you've got the count domain, the stuff, the count domain, the entities, and the count in the mass domain, the gunk, the stuff, and even though they may be realized in the same sort of perceptive object, that doesn't mean that they're the same thing in some ontological sense. Now, how to make sense of that metaphysically, I really don't know, but we do talk about them as different. Or we can say that John, Paul, George, and Ringo are a quartet. Then that doesn't mean, we also say John, Paul, George, and Ringo are musicians. So that entails that John's a musician, and George is a musician, and Paul is a musician, and Ringo's a musician. But John, Paul, George, and Ringo are a quartet doesn't entail that John's a quartet, and George is a quartet, and Ringo's a quartet, etc. Right? So it's not just with the difference between the count and the mass domain, the stuff of which the things are made versus the things themselves. The things themselves persist in a lattice in which there are sums of individuals, which both one and the same time are sums of those individuals, but they also have their own properties, like being a quartet. All right. And so John, Paul, George, and Ringo are the Beatles, but John isn't the Beatles, etc. So they have different properties, and there's a whole range of fascinating issues having to do with natural ontology in the and Schubert and Pelletier talked about this a lot in philosophy of language. Now Frederica Moltmann, who's as much a philosopher as a semanticist, but she's also trained in linguistics, has a lot of work going on about natural language ontology. She tends to want to make more commitments about what exists on the basis of the way we talk about things existing. I'm much more on the conservative side. I'm with Emmenbach. I think there's lots of reason to be careful. We may talk about things in such a way it's useful to talk about an entity, the sky. Whether I think there's a sky, I don't know. I really don't necessarily think there's a thing, the sky. I mean, it's like a Buddhist, is there an ego, Craig? I don't know. That's an ontological question, a deep metaphysical question I don't have an answer to, but I'm happy to talk about Craig and her properties. You know what I mean? So, yeah. So I think these are, let me put it this way. If you assume that when we talk about something that entails that we take it to exist, then you're going to run into some real problems. That's the kind of thing we talked about in our seminar. Whereas being more conservative and taking there may be a very important and subtle difference between them is a really, I can still think I can say true things about the sky without there necessarily being an entity, the sky. Why is that? That's the interesting question for me, and not whether talking about something entails that I think it exists. Yeah? It's a much more subtle question. And it has to do with the difference between attributing things, including existence, versus believing in it or knowing it or whatever, taking it to be metaphysically so. Yeah. These are difficult questions. Very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder, oftentimes it might be that we use this sort of existential language, or we say things like, there is this or that exists. And sometimes we mean it in a serious way, but maybe sometimes can be given a sort of appropriate paraphrase where, well, what does it mean to say the sky exists? Well, I'm not really saying there's this object out there that is the sky, but I don't know. It could be given a paraphrase, or the example I like is somebody did the tango earlier, and I said, well, that them doing that dance, that occurred, but maybe there isn't a thing like that dance on that occasion, or I could think of a Formula One race, or
here's another kind of thing: natural kinds. So if I say dinosaurs are extinct, okay, that seems true, undeniably true. And there's a sense in which there's a natural, no particular diet. You can't, just because, Oscar the Tyrannosaurus and Melvin the, whatever other kind of dinosaur there is are dead, and have no offspring. That doesn't mean that dinosaurs are extinct. So you can't say that that predication is true because particular dinosaurs are dead, It's something about the kind, natural kind dinosaur. And you can give an explanation of when it's true. But the point is, does the kind itself exist? Does the kind itself exist? You can't reduce kinds to their DNA either quite, in general, because there's other kinds of things that aren't natural things in biological terms, right? So, and kinds of events. And yet there are true generalizations to be made about these things. Does that mean that those things exist in the same way that instantiations of them exist? And Greg Carlson did very important work a long time ago, very important work on natural kinds. His dissertation is still worth reading on that. That was out of UMass Amherst. And he models them in terms of there's a strata of entities in the model, kinds, and there's a strata of entities in the model, individuals, and there's a substrata of that are time slices of individuals, So it might be something true of me as an individual, but not at this particular time slice, etc. Right? So and are those things existent all as separate entities? I don't know, but he makes the semantics work really pretty. Okay, so you don't want to say that's wrong. So what are kinds? Do they exist in the same way that their instantiations do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we might want to say something like in the dinosaur case, for example, well, is the kind dinosaur extinct, or at least non-avian dinosaurs? How is that extinct? Well, in the sense that all of the non-avian dinosaurs no longer exist. They're no longer alive. That's maybe what it means for that kind to be extinct, and we're not saying anything more.
Well, what if there's still dinosaur cells deep in, bogs somewhere in the earth that in fact are still viable by some miracle, and we get them out and put them in the right context, they grow like a loomy thing, and does that mean that dinosaurs were not extinct at that time? Maybe, I don't know. What's a kind? That's the point. Just it just raises just that kind of thought experiment raises important questions about what do you mean about what a kind is apart from its instantiations. Yeah.
All right. So if you had the Jurassic Park type scenario, would we say that, well, they are no longer extinct, or they were never extinct?
Yeah.
Maybe not so clear.
Yeah. What do you say? What do you say about that? Yeah. So I mean, I think these are the kinds of puzzles you don't want to just wipe away by saying they exist or they don't exist. They shed light on what we think existence is, and I think they should be important questions to ponder for metaphysicians in particular. But that doesn't mean that there's an easy answer from natural language. That's what I'm saying. Okay? So I'm not saying they aren't exciting, interesting puzzles. I'm just saying language doesn't give you the answer. You should study it because it tells you something about the way we talk about them. Hence, that's useful, but it doesn't answer the questions. Those are philosophical questions, not linguistic questions, not questions to be solved by language. That's what I think.
Good. All right, so I just have a couple questions and we can wrap up. I know we've been going for a while, but it's really good stuff.
It's a pleasure.
So yeah, yeah. So I mean, what are some of the? You've already talked about this a little bit here and there, but what are some of the open problems in formal semantics and pragmatics that you find very difficult or puzzling, or not sure how to approach?
Yeah. Well, gosh, there's a whole lot of them. I think that's hard. Just to writ large, there's a big question that you raised earlier about what is the boundary between semantic content on the one hand as given by the semantic content of parts and their syntactic structure of the utterance in which they occur versus the semantics. Where do you draw that line? And there's a lot of work still being done in which things like conversational implicatures, which is the sort of thing that Grice talked about. An example is a quantity, we call a quantity implicature, like John has 5 children. Should you take that to mean he has 5 and no more than 5, or at least 5? And is that an ambiguity, or does it have one or the other meanings, and then context can resolve which context can give you the other meaning. So Gricean, standard Gricean story would be John has 5 children means John has at least 5, but certain contexts would lead you to think at least 5 and no more than 5. For example, that's just one kind of case. Lots of other quantity implicatures. Here's one that's fairly obviously not part of the semantic content. I ask you to write, this is all Grice, I ask you to write a letter of reference for your graduates. I've got a job and I'm considering your graduate student, Max, for the position. And I say, please write a letter of reference for Max. And this is a philosophy job, okay? So you write this letter and says, Max is a really great guy. He's a lot of fun to be around. And he has beautiful handwriting. Sincerely, Troy. What am I going to think of that? Well, that conveys very much that given that you're sincere and you're trying to be cooperative, and that what's relevant is his skill at philosophizing on the one hand and teaching philosophy on the other, and the fact that you haven't said anything about either of those two things, and that implies that you don't have anything good to say. Yeah? So that relevance, that lack of relevance of what you said to my question implies you don't have anything good to say, i.e. he's not a good candidate. Now, we don't want to build all that into the meaning of, Max is a great fellow and he has beautiful handwriting, right? So that's a conversational implicature that arises from the context and as a function of what was actually said versus the question under discussion, what should be said, right? That's a relevance implicature. On the other hand, these quantity implicatures, now there's a whole literature coming out of work by Gennaro Chierchia and a whole bunch of his associates at MIT now, which argue that scalar implicatures, quantity implicatures in particular, like 5, should be built into the semantics of the utterance in which they arise. And again, I'm not going to go into the details of that, but I mean, I'm on the context baby end of it, not the invisible logical operators and syntactic logical form side. But it's a debate, and there's empirical evidence, and it hasn't yet been resolved to most people's satisfaction. But that's just one feature. There's a lot of things about scope, and I have this new paper on modal auxiliaries and their interpretation, where I argue that the domain restriction is essentially pragmatically given, and I have constraints on how it can arise and what it can be, whose perspective can be understood to be the domain, give you the domain for a given modal auxiliary in a particular structure and context of utterance. Valentin Haccard wants to give that in the logical form, the syntactic logical form, so make it part of the semantic content. I argue she's wrong, but it's unresolved in the literature. I don't want to pretend that everybody would say, oh yeah, well, Craige said so, it's right. This is a debate that's ongoing. And I'm just saying that's another feature of meaning, where whether it belongs in the semantic content versus in the pragmatics is under discussion. I'm very interested now, and it's related to the work on the epistemic modals, in the interpretation of indexicals. I think in philosophy of language, it's sometimes thought that it's more or less resolved, that Kaplan's story is the right story about the interpretation of indexical, and they directly refer to particular features of the context of utterance. But it turns out there's language in which the first person singular, when it's embedded under an attitude, or at least certain attitude predicates, can refer to the agent of the attitude and not the speaker. So in certain languages, you can say the equivalence of John believes that I am hungry, meaning John believes John is hungry. John believes first person is hungry, etc. So that turns out to just sort of throw the whole question of what an indexical is up in the air in a certain way. So you could say, well, those aren't real indexicals, but they have a whole lot of features that real indexicals in English have. So you don't want to just toss it up like that. You got to capture the commonality. On the other hand, where do you if they are indexicals, where do you capture indexicality? Is that in logical form? Can you shift them as a function of tacit operators in logical form? That's Amy Rose Deal's story in a beautiful, very well argued, very detailed book about shifting indexicals, these indexical first person and here and now counterparts across languages, where they can shift when they're embedded under an attitude to be the agent of the attitude. There's certain other contexts in which they can shift. And so she has a story about that, in which it arises as a function of an operator in logical form, an invisible operator in logical form. So it's part of the semantic content of the utterance. I have a body of work that I've been developing for quite some time, some papers that are still in development, where I'm arguing that that's not correct, that it's essentially pragmatic, and it's the same kinds of underlying perspectives that are available in discourse that anchor the interpretations of modal auxiliaries and of shifted indexicals. Well, that's a big claim, but it's essentially contextual, okay? And it's constrained in a way that you can actually make predictions about whose will be the anchor in which conditions. Now, this is completely open for discussion. It's a big question, big set of, not a question, a set of questions. But you can see that I have a strategy. I have certain tools and contexts that I'm using, and I'm trying to see how far can I go, with making correct predictions with those tools, given that the tools are independently motivated, and they give me the correct empirical predictions, maybe better empirical predictions than the people who argue that it's in logical form. Yeah, that's what I want. I want them to be empirically superior and conceptually superior because they're independently motivated and elegant in the theory of context. But the other people think they have reasons to convey. So this is a debate, right? That is at heart, it's not just about these particular features, but about what is semantic content and what is properly pragmatic features. And what should a context of utterance be? And what is independently motivated so that it can serve as a tool for giving you analysis? And then you want to say, well, Occam's razor, you don't want to put it in logical form. We've got it. We don't need these invisible operators, right? That's my strategy. So that kind of thing, that's a big set of questions that is still open. Yeah. There's a big set of issues about what is a context, what's independently motivated, what's conceptually elegant about what we know about what communication is and what natural language is, and how should those things come to bear in an empirically satisfactory way on an analysis of meaning. Remember what I said earlier, we only have intuitions about meaning. So this distinction between pragmatics and semantics is a theoretical distinction. It's one to be debated. So there's that. That's one big issue. And another big issue is the one you just alluded to about natural language ontology. Like I said, Frederica Moltmann and some other people have a lot of current work going on about what is ontologically well motivated. Let's see, what else? And the big question about what's a context of utterance. I mean, Stalnaker and his students are still going at it about that. So I think, Jeff King has a new book. I just commented on this at the recent APA. He calls them these things supplemental contents. I don't know if I have the name of the book. It's called Supplementals or Supplemental Contents, a new book with Oxford University Press. And they had an author meets critic, and I came and I looked very carefully at the book. This is a very interesting book with a lot of very useful observations and a wide range of linguistic triggers that need supplement in context. And he argues you have to do all this complex reasoning to supplement them. And among other things, he thinks you use the question under discussion, this contribution to context. But when I look at them, what I see is a wide range of anaphoric elements. And he doesn't mention that. And we come at anaphora resolution in a very different way than he's coming at this notion of supplementation. And in particular, I think you can argue that question under discussion and goals and understood goals and intentions have a prospective role in interpretation. They constrain the way that you're going to reasonably take a speaker to mean their utterance in coming discourse. And the question rule under discussion and goals and intentions work in that prospective way. So I have some papers on that, a paper on the architecture of interpretation and dynamic pragmatics. And this bears on Jeff's book. And I'm saying, I think you don't need some of the mechanisms that he's proposing. You understand how the prospective role of this question under discussion. So that's a big issue right there. And I'm sure there's others that I'm overlooking. Those are the ones I'm engaged with. So of course, those are the ones that come most readily to mind for me. Yeah. And I mean, other things about expressives, and expressive semantics. There's a lot of issues there still under discussion, and important ones having to do with modality, but also what they call predicates of personal taste, like delicious, or that candy is delicious. What makes that true? That's a perspectival notion, and I don't think that how to understand those has been thoroughly resolved yet. So, yeah.
Good. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff worth exploring there for sure. I mean, I guess those will have to be questions under a different discussion, I guess.
But those are that have to do with that semantics versus pragmatics issue. That's one reason why I've raised those. There's a lot of others,
but right. Yeah. I'd want to make sort of a side remark and see if you share my perspective about this. Is I don't know. I feel like when I learn more about language and semantics, and it just seems like the more amazing or relevant capacities seem like, or we have this near immediate and often effortless ability to like this immensely complicated semantic generation and interpretation, and it's just kind of amazing. And I wonder if you we develop this from a very young age. I mean, I don't know. Do you share the sort of amazement here? And
I share the amazement 180%, Roy. There isn't a day when I'm working on language that I don't marvel at what we do and do so quickly and so accurately. In fact, misunderstanding is far rarer than it should be by all odds, given the complexity of the phenomenon. And that's one reason why I think it's really important to think about this architecture of interpretation in the way that our expectations and goals constrain interpretation. That means they constrain the search space for what somebody can mean. It makes it easier to get at meaning. And I think we do that. There's good evidence to think that this is parallel to what we do in visual perception, that expectations, Simons and Searle work on, expectations and goals and how they constrain what you see when you're watching a video experimentally. Yeah, this is really important work that says expectations are important in helping us quickly and usually fairly accurately parse the visual phenomena coming at us, so that we can be more effective in an immediate way in responding to our environment and the issues that we're trying to address there. Yeah, so I think that's one of the things that I like about working on pragmatics in a formal way, so that it makes predictions, right? That the theory makes predictions and the pragmatics makes predictions about what you're going to take my utterance to mean, so that it simplifies or makes the task more feasible, more viable, makes it more likely that you will be able to quickly and relatively accurately retrieve my intended meaning. Right? That's amazing. But it is amazing. And children are learning it all the time. That's one reason why, a lot of this has to do with intention recognition and understanding, grasping the question, the topic that you intend to be under discussion, and your goals and intentions in asking, what are you getting at? That's important to understand. And it's well known, sadly, that autistic children who have a hard time developing a theory of mind, meaning a theory of the other as having a mind with certain goals and intentions that are distinct from mine, right? If you don't do that, you can't understand that somebody might have a goal, a question, an intention in mind that you're supposed to read. You're supposed to grasp that in as a way of helping grasp your intentions in making an utterance. And those same children who have trouble developing a theory of mind have trouble acquiring language, especially in lexicals and other things that are context sensitive in the ways that context sensitivity to goals, intentions, and the question under discussion requires, right? So to me, that's very telling that the developing a formal theory like this starts to get us at how it is that little children are able to acquire this capacity for rapid interpretation, not just of semantic content, but of pragmatically intended meaning in context. Because we're built to read each other's minds, to grasp each other's intentions. Yeah. So yeah, but is it amazing? Yes. It is an incredible ability. That's one of the first things when I was teaching undergraduates, I would always try to do is start by blowing their minds and showing them that they could do things that they didn't imagine they could do, and that nobody ever taught them because they never even knew, and their mother never even knew that they could do them linguistically, right? So I can do that, in a class, and it's a lot of fun. And then they open their minds and think, well, what the hell is this thing we're doing, right? It's very deep. It's very deep, and it tells us a lot about this thing here. It tells us a lot about this incredible gift of human language. Yeah.
Yeah, very good way to put it. So yeah, I do normally end these interviews with kind of general metaphilosophical question about the value of philosophy. So I don't know if you want to comment on that. What do you think the value of philosophy is? Maybe if you want to talk specifically about stuff in semantics or just philosophy more generally. Yeah, what do you think?
Well, I can say a little bit about both. I mean, in general, I think the value of philosophy is to teach us to question our presuppositions and to think carefully about our assumptions and our facile assumptions about what others mean. I think you're never going to grow as a person in a deep way if you don't question yourself and question the social assumptions that we make as communities. You just have to do that if we're going to grow and open up the possibility of change and growth. Yeah. So, and I think that philosophy at its best, what it does is force us to look at difficult questions. Sometimes questions that maybe are so good that we'll never answer them, but they lead us to investigations that we might never have gotten to. So I think paradox is useful for that reason. My friend Fred Lonkman, a fine logician, said paradoxes are not things to solve, they're things to savor, and I like that perspective. So philosophy makes us savor the important questions, some of them paradoxical, some of them resolvable, but savor them so that we can think and reflect about what we can assume to be true and what not. Open up new doors. So that's one thing. But when it comes to language, I think we take so much for granted about what we are and our interactions with others. I mean, I'll never forget the first time that I had a very interesting conversation with a deaf person where I was at the University of Rochester, where they have a profound commitment to providing interpreters for the deaf community and members of their faculty. So we had this gentleman, I can't say his name right now, a really fine psycholinguist who studies acquisition and linguistics in the deaf. And he had an interpreter, a sign language interpreter. And I sat and talked with him. I think the etiquette is you don't look at the interpreter. And when he speaks, the interpreter, translates to you. And the interpreter then signs back to him. So he has to look at the interpreter sometimes, but you don't. You look at him. And I had this it's hard to convey this profound sense of, oh my God, there's this other. It's almost like as if you were with a creature that is not just somebody that you just ooze your meanings into. There's this very complex communication going on, which uses his hands and signs that are very different in character than my vocal sounds. And yet we're able to have a conversation about very complex, abstract things, which neither of us could ever point at in the world, because we were talking about linguistic theory, for goodness sake. Yeah. And for me, that was an encounter with other, and the complexity and the marvel of the communication capacity that it was just, we take each other for granted so much of the time that when I'm chatting with my husband in the kitchen, it's almost like he's not other. You just sort of take it for granted, but he's almost, like when you're a kid, your mom's an extension of you, So there's something about beginning to appreciate what this capacity is and what it requires of us that sheds light on what we are in a way that I think can, like many other things we can study about ourselves, that can help us to grow in appreciation and respect for each other and for our capacity. And gratitude.
Yeah, fair enough. That's a great way to summarize some of the main values there. I agree with that completely. So yeah, I guess I'll draw the questions to an end there, but it's been really great having Professor Roberts and getting to hear your thoughts on these topics has been very interesting, and thanks so much for doing this.
It's very well done, Troy. Thank you. The questions were well put, and I enjoyed talking with you. So let me know if you need any clarification later. Okay.